meeting in Geneva was canceled in September because of the travel restrictions. And Ganoon and his colleagues agreed to help promote this event to the experts as kind of an interim discussion of religious freedom topics until next year's event can be held. And so I wanted to give both Brett Scharfs the opportunity to say hello from BYU, and he will be followed with greetings from the IRLA by John Ney, Ambassador John Ney. And then at that point, Alexei will introduce our first panel. So go ahead, Brett.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. I appreciate Nicholas and Alexei and their leadership on this. I'm a little bit of a latecomer, but grateful for the opportunity to be involved. A number of the participants also were a part of a blog webinar that our center helped organize with 5 other centers of law and religion around the United States. And that and this, I think, are really good examples of sort of some of the innovative and creative ways we're trying to respond to what some people have been calling the after time, the life after COVID. And I think this type of conversation is really important, and then utilizing the various platforms we have for communication is also very important. So I'm deeply grateful to Ganoon and Fides et Libertas for publishing the papers that we are working on for this. We'll also publish on our various blogs and websites preliminary versions of the papers as soon as you can get them to us. We'll post them as a conversation. And so our goal is to sort of have 2 things happen. One is the possibility for reflective conversation while we're still in the thick of it, but also the opportunity to try to amplify and make that thinking available to a broader audience, both through the electronic posting of the materials and then the print publication of them. So I'm very grateful to be a part of this, because that's not a style of work in which we engaged a year ago at this time. And I think it's a style of work that is really responsive and generative to the situation we're in, but also a style of work that I think we're going to learn from, and it will help us figure out how to work better and smarter as we move forward. So thank you to everyone for participating, and welcome.
Ambassador Ney.
Oh, thank you. And I am really glad to join. I was delighted that Nicholas was organizing this. I think it's super timely. If you just imagine the Supreme Court decision last week that related to the Diocese of Brooklyn versus Andrew Cuomo, and how that handed down a decision directly speaking to the issues of religious liberty. And I think we've all been comfortable that the various restrictions have generally not been infringing on religious liberty, but at the same time, as the petition had pointed out, these religious groups felt like they were being treated more harshly than comparable secular facilities. Essential businesses could admit as many people as they wanted, but churches in red zones no more than 10. And so it is an issue that's very timely, and I'm really looking forward to all of the papers. I'm really pleased to get to meet so many of you that I haven't met before. And so thank you, Nick. Thank you, Ganoon, for helping to support it. And let me turn it back to you, Nick.
Sure. Well, really, it's to move on to Alexei from Portsmouth for a word, and then for his panel to be introduced.
Thank you very much, John Ney. Thank you, Nick, and thank you and welcome to all of our participants. So Henri Bergson wrote that we should seek to act as persons of thought, and that we should seek to think as persons of action. And it's my hope that this conference and the subsequent outputs that will come out of it are going to contribute to a wider project of critical reflection that will be relevant to practice in terms of broader issues of the conditions of religious liberty within our globalized world, and perhaps more specifically, in terms of the relationship between collective worship practices and issues of public health in North America, in Europe, and in the world beyond. So, conscious of time, I don't want to elaborate on that further, but I'd like to introduce our first panel. And we're very privileged to have a number of very prominent speakers from across our two continents today. Louis Léon Christian is professor and chair of law and religion at UC Louvain in Belgium. He will speak first. He'll be followed by Ganoun Diop, who is the director of public affairs and religious liberty for the worldwide Seventh-day Adventist Church, who will be followed by Jean-François Meyer, who joins us from Freiburg in Switzerland. He is the director of the Religious Scope Institute there. And finally, Alejandro González Varas is professor of public law at the University of Saragossa in Spain. So each of the contributors will have 15 minutes to present. I will try to keep you to that time, and then we'll have time for discussion afterwards. Louis Léon Christian, I will cede the floor to you. If you're not speaking, could I ask that you cut your mic?
And Alexei, I will just say that if you want to ask questions, type them in the chat during the presentation, and then the chair at the end will both read your questions and also unmute you to give you a chance to follow up on your question.
Thank you, Nick.
So, thank you so much for this invitation. We have already had some meetings in Europe about COVID-19 and religion and law, but it's the first time for me today to be able to discuss with colleagues in the United States or elsewhere in the world. So first I have to try to shift to a PowerPoint.
Excellent. Let's share it
Yes,
now.
Yes,
work?
we
Okay.
can see it.
Okay, thank you. So I have to be just in time. So Belgium is a small European country, but it is one of the countries most affected by the COVID-19 crisis, with more than 17,000 deaths out of 11 million inhabitants, which would be equivalent, I think, in the United States to 500,000 dead people. So Belgium is divided, as you know, surely, into two large French-speaking and Dutch-speaking language regions, with the Brussels capital as a region with a special status. And the proportion of COVID-19 related mortality between these two regions confirms their disparities, since there are approximately twice as many dead among French speakers as among Dutch speakers. You see the map. In the northern part, it is Dutch speakers with a very low mortality, and in the southern part, French speakers with a very high mortality. The Belgian church-state regime is a system of recognized religions. That is a state-subsidized religion with wages for ministers, for religious ministers, and also religious teaching in public schools. 6 religions are recognized. and to which a 7 recognized philosophy was added in 1993. That is the organized secularism. It's a very special thing in Belgium. This is an originality of Belgium by comparison with France. In France, laïcité is a constitutional characteristic of the Republic. But in Belgium, laïcité is one of its recognized religions. Returning to the management of the COVID-19 crisis, 3 characteristics are worth noting and will constitute the content of our short discussion. 3 characteristics. On the first hand, we can observe that health measures restricting religious freedom are supported by the religious leaders who make efforts to theologically re-legitimize the temporary prohibition of collective celebrations. They insist, these religious leaders insist on the role of individual prayer and support to neighbors and to the poor and to the suffering people as an essential means of pleasing God. The second characteristic is the interreligious dimension of the position taken by these religious leaders. They work together on common reactions, common protocols, and common negotiations with the public authorities, at least when they are called upon to enter into these negotiations. Even more, one Catholic bishop was heard to say that the Catholic Church would not demand the resumption of collective celebration in churches until mosques could be allowed to do so as well. And the third observation is the apparent religious illiteracy of the public authorities in Belgium, not only with regard to their own Belgian legislation about cults or religion, but also with regard to Belgian religious realities and their diversity. How can this be explained? Surely by the principle of neutrality, but also through religious ignorance, and perhaps also by a contempt, a public contempt about religions. Well, we come back to our first observations. Religious leaders and their common posture of legitimization of health restriction and religious restriction. During the first progressive deconfinement at mid-May, religious groups had to wait a month later before being allowed to organize collective celebrations. During this month, the leaders of the recognized religions negotiated health protocols with the Belgian government. Limitation on the number of people in place of worship gradually eased from 40 to 200 in August. In early October, the health situation worsened, and the limitation of the number of worshippers returned to 40 by church or worship building. And finally, collective celebration were completely banned and prohibited from the end of October. And this ban was just extended at the end of November until mid-January. Christmas Mass, Christmas festivals was banned in the churches. And festive meals in families are limited to only 1 guest per house. During the first and the second lockdown, all collective religious celebrations have been prohibited with only 3 exceptions. First is about weddings with 5 people attending. Second is about funerals with 15 people attending. And finally, religious service in order to internet streaming or broadcasting with only 10 people working on within the building. During the first lockdown, the obedience of the population was very great, despite very harsh measures, such as the prohibition of all car and pedestrian traffic in the streets, in the roads, but also in the parks, the countrysides, even in the woods. During the deconfinement in May, the various social activities were not reauthorized at the same time. This resulted in a broad social protest with a strong feeling of discrimination between different professions. Several lawsuits were filed by different organizations, but not by the churches. The Catholic bishops and other religious leaders adopted together in a very religious way a discourse of support for the government measures, legitimizing them theologically in the name of the weakest, and with a sense of responsibility in the face of a crisis that was so deadly in Belgium. In France, conservative Catholics decided to appeal to the Conseil d'État and won the case in May. The French Council of State condemns at that time the French government to speed up the reopening of French churches and worship places. But unlike France, the Belgian Council of State rejected the request of some individual people, more or less conservative Catholic. The argumentation of the Belgian Council of State is really impressive because there are certainly some arguments about the lack of expertise on the health security level of religious gatherings. But the main argument is that the Catholic faithfuls have to refer to the position of their bishops, and that these bishops were precisely the first to ban religious celebration on their own initiative in March. And moreover, these bishops, with other religious leaders, were at this very moment negotiating with the Belgian government the future protocols for reopening churches and worship places in June. One of the petitioners advocates the urgent need for the baptism of his newborn child. But again, the State Council notes that the bishops themselves have taken the initiative to ban all baptism ceremonies and to postpone them. So this is a classical case law about religious autonomy in Belgium. The State Council of Belgium still uses the formula spiritual sovereignty. Spiritual sovereignty is the way to describe the religious authority of recognized denomination. But here, this classical argument is reinforced by the fact that bishops were precisely negotiating this issue with the government. This is the only court decision in Belgium on the subject of religious freedom in the face of the COVID-19 crisis, at least as of this day, 2nd of December. In Belgium, we must indeed be careful to a new decision of the French Council of State in France decided last Sunday on November 30. The French Council of State condemned the limitation of collective celebration to a maximum of 30 worshippers. which the Council of State considered discriminatory compared to the less severe limitation imposed on various kinds of secular businesses. This case before the French Council of State included conservative Catholics, but also bishops, Catholic bishops in France. So the question in Belgium is whether this case, this French case, will have an effect again in Belgium. And as you already heard, in Belgium, the limitation of freedom of religion is even greater than in France. Collective celebrations are totally forbidden, including at Christmas. The Belgian government last week, on November 27, decided to partially reopen non-essential secular shops to facilitate the purchase of Christmas gifts. But the government did not suspend the ban on religious ceremonies, including on Christmas Day. But the most shocking for a part of the population, of the Belgian population, have been the speech of the Prime Minister of Belgium on this occasion. In his speech, the Prime Minister pronounced the word Christmas more than 100 times, without ever, at no time, evoking the religious dimension of these holidays, on these ceremonies, nor evoking the harshness it represents, the ban of religious ceremonies for Christian people. This situation in Belgium is therefore under tension between a new French case in favor of religious freedom and a Belgian government which banned religious worship without any empathy in its speech. This is surely the indication of a very high secularization of the Belgian society, but this is not enough to explain the lack of empathy of government towards religions, even if they are, or precisely because they are minorities. In any case, after this ruling by the Council of State in Paris, and after this non-empathetic speech by the Belgian Prime Minister, in any case, the Belgian bishops took a stand. Sorry, I have forget my PowerPoint. So you can read here the press release published by the Catholic bishops after the French decision of the Council of State and after this bad speech by the Belgian Prime Minister. And you can read that the Belgian bishops expressed their sad feelings about the situation, but above all, they expressed their willingness to resume negotiations with the government and confirm their support for the health measures taken by the public authorities, and finally, the importance of joining the national efforts in the field of public health. They will therefore not take any legal action. But we don't know what will happen with isolated followers who are opposed not only to the government limiting freedom of worship, but also opposing their own religious leaders they consider too soft or not firm enough. And now some last observation. Yes,
I'm very sorry.
Okay.
It's not that I want to cut you off. I'm just very conscious of time for the other speakers.
Sure.
And there's a number of questions that have already come up. So
thank you.
If you don't mind, we could pass on to Ganoon and then we could raise some of your other points.
It's okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So without further ado, I give the floor to Ganoon Diop.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I would like to share the screen and then...
Yes, sorry.
No problem. let me, very good. So let me share the screen right now, and that will probably make it easier. I will try to keep on the time. Well, first of all, thank you very, well, let me do this. There we go. I would like to thank Nick, for your initiative, and then the three institutions organizing this conference. And thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Brett, for this opportunity. And as you know, I'm very supportive of this initiative. But without further ado, let me just get onto my topic that I entitled Reflecting on the Measure of Our Humanity, Revisiting the Imperative of Human Solidarity. Let me just do it here. Trying to find a spot that I could, yes. So the following reflection focuses on what one can call the first human right, and that is the right to be human, actually. And I will develop more on this. The right to be human, to be related to as a full human being and be treated as such. So this right is intrinsically connected to the imperative of human solidarity. This is especially true in times of pandemics, natural disasters, or societal upheavals and challenges. Now, the concept of human solidarity has received a major emphasis at the United Nations recently, actually as key to meeting the challenges of life's predicaments during the time of pandemic. In fact, addressing leaders of the world's richest countries at the G20 summit recently, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, referring to the COVID pandemic, said the following. So he said the following. Trying to find a spot that I can read my text. Yes, okay, there you go. So he said we need solidarity and cooperation. And we need concrete action now, especially for the most vulnerable. Then, speaking to leaders of these of the world, he also said further the following: the recent breakthrough on COVID-19 vaccines offer a ray of hope, but that ray of hope needs to reach everyone. That means ensuring that vaccines are treated as a global public good, a people's vaccine accessible everywhere. And he continues saying, this is not a do-good exercise. It is the only way to stop the pandemic dead in its tracks. And then here is now the key: solidarity is indeed survival. Now, in the following, we will explore the moral foundation of human solidarity. At the onset, it may be useful to specify what solidarity is not and expand briefly on its true nature. Solidarity is not condescendence from a superior to an inferior. It is not charity in the sense of giving of one's surplus. It is not aid wealthy nations share with developing countries that have been victims of resources plunder for centuries. As a matter of fact, an infamous example having been the partition of Africa, for example, at the Berlin Conference in 1884. Solidarity is not just compassion in the sense of being moved because of other people's predicament. Compassion is indeed part of what it means to be human. It is needed, but being human means more. Solidarity, in fact, has deeper roots. Solidarity is motivated by a shared identity, a shared humanity, and actually a shared destiny, a shared destiny. It is characterized by an embrace of the shared mystery of being human. This shared humanity goes beyond mere biological features, intellectual potential, emotional makeup, or the same socialized patrimony or heritage. It is part of a deep, mysterious belonging to the realm of the spiritual, an irreducible spiritual dimension which escapes definitions and confinements. Humans are unique by virtue of not just our rationality or our capability to feel and express emotions, but by virtue of our spiritual dimension also. Our deep roots transcends the observable. Our thoughts cannot be seen. Nonetheless, our rationality explores the external world to make sense of what we see. From there, our conscience, our center of ethical valuation, operates in the inner chambers of our being where no one has access. But this is where are formed how we relate to all others. Every decision made is supposed to be born from that secret space that functions like an inner sanctum, actually a sacred space. Precisely, our solidarity as and with human beings is grounded and nurtured by the inner conviction that human beings are sacred, unquantifiable by materialistic means. The importance of freedom of conscience, now coming to our topic, lies precisely at this intersection. Freedom of conscience functions like a sign, a constant remembrance or reminder of the full humanity of every person we meet. It is critical to uphold, to promote, and to protect this freedom, especially in times of vulnerability, fragility, and widespread infections from viruses and pathogens. With the above clarification, I can now postulate that the main reflection I would like to submit to your consideration is that the fundamental issue which undergirds the main challenges during a time of pandemic, and by the way, exacerbated by the reality of social tensions, recently, in particular, due to discriminations based on racism, tribalism, ethnocentrism, casteism, classism, or any form of expression of supremacist ideologies, is the measure of our humanity. It would be unfortunate, an unfortunate omission, actually, not to address the problem of disenfranchisement of minority populations in America, in Europe, and elsewhere. The indigenous people of the Americas and Black people and people of color in general are disproportionately affected by the virus. These populations present the highest rate of fatalities from COVID-19. Now, how to think about religious freedom in such a context? Existing preconditions, some of which, as in the case of populations in southwestern United States, are due to exposure, for example, to uranium mining, radiation causing health issues like bone cancer, kidney damage, and lung cancer, giving people little freedom, actually, and protection from COVID-19 and other debilitating and deadly diseases. Also, many low-income persons are daily exposed to the virus for being frontline workers and caretakers. So the viruses then spread more in contexts where disenfranchisements abound, in contexts where racist policies, discrimination, victimization of citizens have been perpetrated for generations. Unquestionably, systemic, structural, and institutional racism stemming from the colonial era and its institution has put at a disadvantage populations that do not have the means, the health, the medical structures, and tools to efficiently fight against physical fragility and vulnerability to pathogens and death agents. What exacerbates the current situation for minority population in particular is the racialization of the one human family, which makes it nearly impossible to establish social justice. So then, framing my presentation in the context of the revealing current pandemic, I hope that this is seen more than just an academic exercise. But my overarching thesis, though, is the belief that The first human right is the right to be human, and that is to have one's full humanity recognized, respected, and protected. This full humanity of every person should not be diminished in any way because of skin color, gender, or functional social status. So one of the key distinctive characteristics of our humanity is not just consciousness, but conscience, freedom of conscience, and the necessity of free will, without which self-determination would always remain aspirational, but never operational in that sense. So advocating and working for a more just world is a good place to start. The respect of every person's conscience being paramount in this endeavor. So then this means a benevolent attitude towards all others is a sure path to genuine solidarity with the whole human family. So the responsibility to solidarity with the whole human family is expressed in the consensus of the UDHR. It is a solidarity not based on charity in the sense of helping the poor, but on the constant consciousness of what everyone shares with the poor, and that is the dignity of the human person, regardless of social circumstances. So the focus on rights may have somewhat overshadowed the sine qua non of human responsibility toward every other in the context of solidarity. As poignantly stated, I quote, "The categorical imperative operates primarily to tell you what you must not do to other people, not what you should do for them. Therefore, the need to revisit and restore the core of what makes us human, that is the responsibility of solidarity with the whole human family." What is at stake, really, and one of the most pressing questions is the understanding and adoption of what it means to be human. And Archbishop Rowan Williams insightfully expressed this problematic as follows: "If there is one great challenge for our day, it is the pervasive sense that we are in danger of losing our sense of the human." But what does it mean to be human? Of course, this is a complex question. And given the time I have, I will not be reviewing philosophical, proposals, definitions, or insights from philosophers. But I can say, though, that restrictive definitions limit the responses to this fundamental question to the issue of belonging to a particular group, whether tribal, ethnic, cultural, philosophical, or religious. But the trajectory of identifying, valuing, classifying, and separating leads to cementing the segmentation of humans into stratification, into superior and inferior, thus stripping part of the human family of their human identity and dignity. So importance based on socioeconomic categorization have become the norm around the globe in nearly every society, and that's a problem. The stripping of the identity of part of the human family or the dehumanization of others takes the trajectory of exclusion actually from a construct, in fact, an arbitrary, non-universal norm one chooses to believe and to elevate to the status of reference of how to view others. And from this premise, humans are theoretically and practically subjected to valuing, segmenting, and dividing into racial categories, castes, and classes. As a problematic consequence, the loss of the sense of the human has led to the legitimization of violence. Now, to make sure that I would, I'm not going to go through all my texts for time's sake. I want to respect the time of the next presenter. So let me just say this, though. In spite of the violations, transgressions, and even consensuses have been achieved at international levels and ratified through declarations, statements, covenants, and conventions. And they all basically contribute to remind people of the one humanity, and this one humanity in need of global solidarity. Let me just move on to say that Practically, the measure of our humanity is tested by how we view and relate to other human beings. And the current reckoning actually against racism challenges ancient practices based on violence against other human beings. Critical questions. The questions which compel us to think more carefully about the true embrace of one humanity are the following. Are there justifications for hierarchical segmenting, valuing of human beings? Are there stratifications and divisions of humanity between superiors and inferior? Because if that is the case, that will make life during times of pandemics extremely challenging. So I would like to go a little further in my presentation to say this. In times of pandemic, the fracture of human society is exacerbated by the trampling of human dignity, the disregard of the sacredness of people's conscience, the violation of other people's full humanity, and subsequent multiform discrimination based on their alleged subhumanity or even second-class citizenship. There must be a better humanity. It could be that the pandemic can be an opportunity to reset the buttons and place human solidarity at the center of human interactions by virtue of a shared humanity. Human solidarity is grounded, in fact, on the mystery of every human being. Human beings are more than biological beings. We are even more than rational beings with remarkable intellectual faculties and capability. There is something about human beings that transcends our analytical skills and tools. Beyond our intellect and emotions, there is an elusive aspect of being human, and that is variously designated as spirit, soul, human consciousness, or even spiritual awareness. Now, I will go to my last slide then. Matter is not all. Let me just go to my last slide to say this, back to just here. Integrating a sense of solidarity with all the human family is the only way forward to recovering a sense of the human based on human dignity and a shared humanity, human identity and destiny. Consequently, I can finish saying wearing masks, social distancing, purposefully being mindful of others' safety and well-being become part of human solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ganoon. I'm sorry again to be a taskmaster.
No, you have to.
Speakers, but trying to stick to the schedule. So without further ado, I give the floor to Jean-François Meyer.
Thank you very much. I don't have slides, so I don't know how you want to see me full screen or just in a corner. It's a choice of the master of the game. I am not a legal expert myself. I'm actually an historian, something of a sociologist with an interest on religious issues in the contemporary world. And of course, the pandemic became a very interesting area for observation. The measures enforced by governments all around the world for fighting against the pandemic were obviously not meant to target religious freedom specifically. Religious activities, however, have been affected like all areas of life have been. And this was nothing new, basically, for religions. Throughout history, religions had already been confronted with measures meant to contain epidemics, and sometimes had themselves been proactive in enforcing them. So there was an historical experience. It was not the first time, for instance, during the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, there were also restrictions on religious worship. I cannot enter into details here. There have been definitely traumatic aspects of this crisis, especially in dealing with religious assistance to dying people, the consequences of the pandemic for funerals, and this would be a topic in itself. But religious freedom really became an issue of public debate at the time governments started to plan the gradual lifting of containment measures in spring. What would be the pace? What would be the extent of for public worship? Interestingly, in early May, the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the European Union expressed concern that the roadmap published by the EU Commission lacked of any explicit mention of religious services. It envisioned the resumption of a number of activities, but not religious services. And it was striking to read the comments by the General Secretary of the Commission. The aggressive approach, I quote, the aggressive approach of certain secularist actors against the role of religion in the public square may have contributed to its marginalization in the context of the current crisis, end quote. Thus, as you see, it's brought into a wider context of different forces at work in the public square, secularist forces and religious bodies. My original intent was to provide a comparative approach of some issues across cultural and religious environments. But to be frank, I've not yet been able to digest the massive and daily increasing material on those issues in a way that would allow me to summarize observations in 15 minutes. Thus, I have decided in this short paper to restrict myself to what is most easily comparable, that is primarily European countries. I am convinced, however, that it would be extremely fruitful to go beyond, since we have the unique opportunity of analyzing the impact in various fields of a crisis that affected simultaneously the entire world. In late April, as I attempted to provide an overview on the way in which Christian churches had dealt in Western countries with the pandemic, I could observe how religious groups had, to a large extent, adjusted to secular requirements meant to prevent the spread of the virus. At a time, obviously, uncertainty ruled. Nobody knew for sure how it would evolve and what it might involve. In late February and early March, there had been some voices claiming that cancelling public worship would be out of question, but in a very short time, more or less everybody complied in a way I would hardly have imagined a month earlier. In a matter of weeks, health issues became paramount in the religious field as well as in other fields. The fact that some religious gatherings in various countries of the world had played a role as super spreaders had definitely contributed to make religious leaders aware of risks involved and of possible subsequent negative impact for the image of religions. It's not surprising, for instance, in French-speaking countries, that following the much publicized case of the super spreader event caused by gathering of the evangelical church La Porte Ouverte in Mulhouse, eastern France, a number of evangelical congregations were faster actually than mainline churches in cancelling public worship. When speaking with staff members of religious groups, I tended to assume quite often that they had their public image in mind. But what came first, and quite understandably, in their own spontaneous reactions, was the concern that believers should cultivate for the preservation of human life. And this is definitely not merely rhetoric, but it's a deep concern that took priority over everything. And this also explains why many temporary sacrifices in terms of religious freedom were accepted then. In many cases, religious groups seemed eager to act in an exemplary way, despite the significant sacrifices this involved for their members, and moreover, during crucial periods of their respective religious calendars. They showed much willingness to go far in adjustments of religious practices. For instance, as early as late February, the Romanian Orthodox Church advised its faithful no longer to kiss icons. For a number of other smaller religious groups, the crisis also presented an opportunity to show that they should be seen as trusted and responsible partners. It was impressive, actually, to see the care of a number of Muslim communities across Europe for developing convincing protection plans. And it's interesting, actually, that the resumption of public services in Germany in late April was actually speeded by a complaint, by a request submitted by a Muslim communities that was able to convince the federal court in Karlsruhe that it had developed such a convincing protection plan that there was no reason to turn down the request. As I mentioned, it was when some of the enforced restrictions started to be lifted, that a number of believers started to ask if public religious life should be seen as less essential. And the debate would become more heated more rapidly during the second wave, as we all know, but this has not only been the case for religious affairs. During the first wave, there was a reluctance of mainline religious groups to confront state authorities regarding measures enforced for containing the pandemic. In several countries, but that has already been mentioned in the paper on Belgium, we can observe how legal action often was first initiated by specific subgroups rather than leading religious organizations. And it's interesting, I draw your attention, I have no time to summarize it here, but to an article that will be published in the next issue of the Journal of Law and Religion and State by Burkhard Bergmann. It's already available as preprint, on the triangular relationship between church, state, and individual believers, as it has been stressed in the pandemic-related discussions. Basically, the initiatives of some individuals or subgroups in attempting to address the issues created for believers. This does not mean, however, that mainline churches remained passive, and there were already during the first wave some strong words. In mid-April, for instance, I must say it was quite unexpected for me to hear the president of the Swiss Bishops' Conference complain that the government, I quote, the government had forgotten the churches, end quote, when planning the lifting of measures. But the usual route was rather the path of negotiation, discussions, since, of course, mainline religious bodies also have their own channels to state authorities. What mattered for them was to ensure that a dialogue with the state would take place. And this may be official or informal. Recently, I asked an official of a Roman Catholic diocese in Switzerland if the bishop had been consulted by local authorities. He answered that there had been nothing formal, no process of consultation, but that informal discussions were taking place indeed, since the bishop and the people in charge knew each other. And this is also something we should take into consideration, what's happening behind the scenes in an informal way that may help, maybe in some cases, to ease a situation. Anyway, from spring, believers sometimes wondered how essential the collective practice of religion was considered. The expression of essential services is one primarily used for other secular, very practical purposes. It is obvious that for a believer, the practice of his or her religion is essential. But the issue was basically how proportionate measures were regarding religion. And here it's interesting that even within religious denominations, you would have sometimes different views of this issue, depending also not only on theological views, but sometimes on political views as well. While describing collective religious practice as essential or not, in comparison with other activities, raises emotions and definitely tells something about the perception of religion by state and society, such an appreciation will necessarily differ. Astutely, beside offering evidence that public worship is secure, the faith community's leaders who signed a collective letter to the British Prime Minister in early November for expressing their concerns at restriction measures attempt to show that public worship is essential, not in itself, but in the way it provides support to believers for contributing to society, social action, social cohesion, mental health, and so on. And I think it is an intelligent approach for pleading for public worship in an increasingly secular environment. But whatever contributions to society are provided by religious bodies, what remains crucial is to state that the exercise of religion as a community is and remains an essential component of religious freedom, which personal prayer cannot replace. Religious freedom and freedom of worship as a group are always essentially related. And the principle itself should be and remain supported as a fundamental freedom. And this is basically what both the Council of State in France and the Supreme Court in the US have recently reaffirmed. At the same time, the proportionality is obviously taken into consideration, the way comparable secular facilities are treated. The fact also that religious services can be shared online through a variety of channels has been a blessing in some ways for keeping in touch, although online services raises other questions. But the availability of online services should not become a pretext for extending the closure of places of worship. And here I think there is an underestimated but potentially important issue. In an article published, I've seen from the moderators that I have still 1 minute and 30 seconds available. In an article, so I am shortening my paper, I've been doing it for a few minutes already. In an article published this week by La Croix International, a journalist remarks that what worries Rome is not so much the closure of churches for health reasons, but rather government interference in how worship services are organized. And this is another very important aspect of religious freedom issues when we are looking at the pandemic. I cannot resist quoting an amazing example we had in Switzerland in spring, when the federal health authorities published rules for allowing the resumption of public worship. They instructed that communion should not be allowed. The Protestant Church complied, but the Roman Catholic Church intervened behind the scenes without much noise, and a revised version of the rules, without any mention of communion, was published a few days later. Interestingly, the new rules, not only about the issue of communion, the new rules were much shorter than the original ones. And I think that this could also be probably a guideline for any state agency having to deal with issues pertaining to religious freedom. The best is to offer a general orientation without going into details that might impact on what is definitely essential to members of a religious group, even if an outsider might not be aware of it. Only general orientation. Religious freedom obviously needs also to be put into context, and I won't have time here to compare some European countries regarding the limit to 30 people, but it's interesting to see that the debate is not the same in different countries regarding that. It's obvious that in some countries, for instance, the whole debate on religious freedom is also part of ongoing cultural wars that are related to other wider considerations. So I have really, I think, to close here, but maybe I may close by one remark in an article recently published in German on the relations between states and religious bodies around the world during the COVID-19 crisis. Andreas Jacobs from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung remarks that it has offered an opportunity to test those relations with various outcomes. And he quotes a number of examples. For instance, in Pakistan, it has allowed religious activist groups to affirm their power, while in Greece, the state has mostly been able to assert its authority in relation to the dominant Orthodox Church. Thus, the discussion on religious freedom needs to be considered into that wider context. I would have many other things to say about that, but obviously I have to close because I know the next speaker is waiting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-François Meyer. Excellent. So moving on swiftly, there's already a number of questions and points of debate, but moving on swiftly before the discussion, I give the floor to Alejandro Gonzalez Varas.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. It's really an honor to deliver this speech in this webinar and to meet you again, or for the first time. So thank you to organizers. I'd like to shift a PowerPoint that I have to that you have it because it has been shared, but I'd like to shift it now. Only a minute, please. Is it possible to see it? Can you see it well? Yes. Well, thank you. Yes. So, well, I'm going to explain the spread of coronavirus across Europe and the rules enacted by the European Union and member states. And then I'll go deeply into the specific situation of religious freedom, and I'll finish relating reactions of the religious denominations in Europe. Well, we know that coronavirus has arrived to the European continent so suddenly that in the rest of places in the world, no, we can see in this slide the last figures about the coronavirus in autumn, in October, and it is possible to check to take evidence that it has been changing in this month with only 20 days of difference, no. We can see the differences between from the 4th October to the 26th October and how the different countries have changed the situation. No? Well, from the beginning, the European Union had to take quick measures in order to avoid the spread of the virus across the continent. The European Union has tried to support national health systems and counter the socio-economic impact of the pandemic at both national and European Union level. It has fostered different measures in many fields, such as economics, public health, or borders. Well, we can begin tracing a common framework in the European Union countries. First of all, the situation has been rather uncoordinated and changing in every country itself, no, in the whole of the countries themselves, and even some chaotic in some cases. On the other hand, more than half of the European Union's member states have proclaimed a state of emergency. In some cases, it is lasting much longer than an exceptional situation would be. For example, in Spain, will last until May 2021. In other cases, the system of sources of law is being used incorrectly. From this point of view, certain important measures that touch the fundamental rights are being enacted by rules that are not suitable for this task. It is also necessary to point out that all member states introduce border or travel restrictions and have prohibited public gatherings, including religious ones, for the first COVID wave in spring. The most of them even declared home confinement, at least for some weeks. Infections and deaths decreased in summer, and nevertheless, in October, the COVID context became worse in states that had to establish further restrictive measures. Maybe that they have not been so strong than in spring, but they have often established curfew or local and regional confinements, or they are still limiting the number of people who can go to public places, including worship ones. Well, this slide shows well, the different measures in every country. For European people, it is very known. Perhaps for an American public, it's not so known, but it is the situation with different measures in April. In July, the coronavirus situation and the measures of every states, and the response in the autumn. It's from October, 26th of October, this slide. Well, even though it was thought that the way back to normality would be very long, it was also clear that the spring extraordinary confinement measures couldn't last indefinitely. The members of the European Council decided to go on working to limit the spread of the virus at a meeting in March. So the President of the Commission and the President of the European Council signed a joint European roadmap towards lifting COVID containment measures. It states that constant dialogue with social partners will be key. I think that it should include the dialogue with the religious denominations, as it is led in the Article 17 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union. Anyway, the roadmap says that in the process of relaxing the confinements, the gatherings of people should be progressively permitted. However, it doesn't speak at any time about religious celebrations. The European Union has developed further tools in order to check the legal health of the European Union member states and to help them to cut down the COVID spread. One of the most representative has been the Council's recommendation aimed at ensuring the coordination and timely communication at the European Union level of measures taken by member states that restrict free movement. Then the Commission has delivered a communication entitled 2020 Rule of Law Report, the rule of law situation in the European Union. It also analyzed the risk for the rule of law that some of the states' legal measures about pandemic threat to bring about. It should be added that the European Commission has announced the need of building the European Health Union, so it is a news. Unlike the European Union context, the Council of Europe's texts have made specific references to religious freedom indeed, such as the document respecting democracy, rule of law, and human rights in the framework of the COVID sanitary crisis, which speaks about religious freedom and other human rights. Well, once that the legal situation as a whole has been described, we are able to go deeply into the specific situation of religious freedom. I shall start pointing that the vast majority of countries have not established the obligation to close places of worship, nor they have prohibited the celebration, with exceptions obviously, of religious acts, even in spring. This hasn't prevented that the fact that there have been restrictions for it. This result could have been due either to limitations to general mobility of the people, or to the fact that religious worship has been provided that the number of people didn't reach a specific amount. Anyway, complaints from religious denominations didn't arise in the first moment in spring, but in the lifting of restrictive measures in summer and the end of the spring. The reason was that collective religious activities were not allowed, in many cases, at the same time than other ones, like sport or cultural events. We are going to have the opportunity to examine these claims further on. Now, let's have a look to a few of representative countries to check the health of their religious freedom. Well, let's start with Spain. Spain has had two armistices. In the first one, there wasn't a ban to open places of worship. Quite rather, attendance of places of worship was conditioned to the adoption of organizational measures consisting of avoiding crowds of people. But in a parallel way, there was home confinement, in virtue of which nobody could leave his or her home, save in the case of essential services. These essential services were specified in the royal decree, in the rule, enacted in March. Public worship wasn't in that list, as it happened in several European countries. Then there was an indirect curtailment of the religious freedom. The decree that established the second state of alarm in October has offered a better treatment to religious freedom. People is allowed to remain in worship places in the number indicated by the public authorities. Well, let's go to Italy. The Italian context has been similar to that of Spain. People were entitled to entry in a church if he or she were allowed to leave his or her home to enjoy or to deliver an essential service. But he or she was not allowed to leave his or her home to go specifically to church. Again, the point, what is an essential service? Are public administrations, are public authorities entitled to define if religion is essential or not essential? What about the public powers neutrality and the cooperation with the religious denominations? Well, in Italy, there were restrictions even at the end of April, and the Italian Bishops' Conference was critical of the government. Finally, the Holy See had to mediate between the Bishops' Conference and the Italian government, and they reached an agreement that was then enlarged to the other religious denominations, and it was possible to develop religious celebrations provided that these agreements were enforced. Well, and the last words for Germany and France. We have listened to the Professor Christians about Belgium. It has been very interesting, and other countries in Europe. And I'm going to finish with these two ones. Well, France allowed places for worship to be open, but any gathering within them was banned. The government approved afterwards some decrees that kept limits to celebrate public worship, while they allow other kinds of activities in the same situation than Spain or Italy or other countries. The Conseil d'État found that such measures violated the principles of proportionality and necessity. It has been a difference with the German framework, where the Federal Constitutional Court has ruled in an opposite way. In fact, two decisions issued on the 10th of April admitted that the restrictions to public worship adopted by the states of Hesse and Berlin were legitimate. This freedom should, religious freedom, I mean, should yield to other constitutional interests, such as third person's life. It was the outcome of a proportionality exam, like the court said. Well, this is the last slide to show the response of religious denominations to the closure of places of worship and the later reopening. Well, the most of religious denominations have cancelled their public worship activities, and they have broadcast them, both in the European countries and in the United States. They have adapted their rights to pandemic and their liturgical activities and other ones. The Holy See set up a Vatican COVID Commission indeed. Religious denominations have developed a cooperative attitude with civil authorities. For the majority of European religious groups, the civil measures that have held large gatherings, including worship services, don't especially target the churches, at least at the beginning, in the first confinement in spring. So they haven't usually spoken about a direct infringement of religious freedom, I mean, again, in the first epoch. Quite rather, it was considered as necessary for the common and public health. This hasn't prevented them from showing their complaints about the limits eventually imposed on religious freedom. In the European frame, the most root denominations, such as Christian churches, have claimed that the reopening of churches must be implemented in dialogue with ecclesiastical authorities. The Commission of Bishops of the Bishops' Conference of the European Union reiterates that religion isn't a merely private issue. It also has a public and collective dimension that cannot be marginalized. Moreover, they regret that the European Union roadmap lacked any explicit mention of religious services. There have been other denominations from the evangelical side, for example, that have also agreed on these words. In short, the religious confessions have cooperated with the civil authorities, but they have also defended their interests. The last example can be found in France. Like Professor Christian has said, we know that the French government had decided in November to limit access to places of worship to 30 people. Religious denominations have stated that this decision means that religious beliefs is accessory. The French Bishops' Conference has asked the Conseil d'État to override government's decision, and it has been accepted by the Conseil d'État. Well, I'm finishing only a conclusion remarks. We can say that these situations have usually not reached the highest courts in European countries, save Germany, and we can join France and Belgium, and there is a case law in the European Union courts or in the European Court on Human Rights. This is a difference from the situation in the United States, where the banning of religious gatherings has raised more often litigation in US courts, even the Supreme Court. In fact, there have been swift cases such as Calvary Chapel Dayton Valley versus Sisolak or South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom that are good examples. And finally, at least in Europe, religious minorities such as Muslims or Jews have had other worries. For them, it has been disturbing the rise of hate speech, racism, stereotyping of minorities, and misinformation. Well, thanks again, and we restart to speak in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro Gonzalez Varas. I think this is really a fantastic foundation for our conference, because we really have a comparison between case studies, but we also have different levels of analysis, from national case studies to more conceptual, broader forms of analysis. I have a number of questions. If you don't mind, I'll curate a bit. I'll take some questions for each speaker, and I'll go through those. If you have a question, please put it into the chat in the first instance. And then if you would like to have a follow-up point or a follow-up question, if you could raise your finger or make yourself known on the chat, and then I can briefly cede the floor to you. I'm just trying to get there so I can see everybody. So to come back to the first question, I think there was a clarification question, perhaps just I think a lot of us are curious when Jean-Louis talked about the discrepancy between Flemish cases and French cases. Brett Scharf's raised that, whether Jean-Louis, you could explain to us why there's that discrepancy. And if I can invoke the prerogative of the chair to also ask a question here. I was struck by, in the Belgian case, that the Belgian Council of State should in a way be more Catholic than Catholics themselves in terms of respecting the authority of the bishops. And it occurs to me that, well, I wonder whether is that characteristic, or could that only occur within a situation of recognized religion? I wonder whether it would be difficult for a secular an authority within a purely secular state to make that sort of interpretation. So if you could respond to those 2 points, and then I have a couple questions for Ganoun and Alejandro and Jean-François.
Thank you, Alexis. On the first point of the question of Brett, the main point is that every question in Belgium are going to draw the linguistic border. And on this question is about the fact that Flemish people have are healthier. They have better public health in general. They have higher salaries and way of life. And finally, perhaps they abide more easily the law than the French-speaking part. So, but perhaps we have also a more biological answers, but it's not my competence. And on the second point, sure, it's very. I think it's very impressive to see the Belgian Council of State being more Catholic than the Catholic people, but it's only a question of fact. It's not a question of law. So they are not. The Council of State is not obliging the faithful people to obey, to abide their bishops. Simply, they said, "What you are claiming about an urgent situation." And I'm not convinced about any urgency because your bishops don't see these emergency. But anyway, it's important. And on your last question, it's not sure that the Council of State would adopt the same ruling about non-recognized churches, even if it is not the question. But anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There were a couple questions for Ganoun. Nick raised a question about, if you could just bear with me, because I need to go through the chat. Nick raised a question of how does a recognition of religious freedom help to combat the socioeconomic exploitation that leads to disproportionate pandemic deaths in minority groups? And can certain kinds of religion actually enhance these disparities?
Well, I think that is the whole purpose of the work of restoration, you know, of the dignity of minority population. And I think this is a work to improve policies, to better the condition of living of people, whether from a medical perspective and otherwise. And this is the reason. But it starts with the recognition of the humanity and the full humanity of this minority population. You see, if we continue keeping the valuing, the segmenting, the hierarchicalization of human being, then of course, people will put some prioritizing, and that's one of the problems. So freedom of conscience, so religious freedom, precisely, I think, is part of a work of restoration of human dignity, and in time of pandemics, reaffirming the importance of every human being is paramount. You know, this is not just a luxury. It's really how comes that the people dying, right, from COVID, I mean, disproportionately are those with low income, those, I mean, the minorities, or I can even say the marginalized minorities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is why promoting religious freedom is really critical at times such as this, precisely.
Thank you, Ganoun. Cole had raised a question for you, Ganoun, regarding, asked, I don't know if you'd like to rephrase or to say this out loud, Cole, but you wrote that you speak about hierarchical segmenting, and Cole was asking how that interacts with the practical need to prioritize the distribution of vaccines?
Well, I think this is a story that we will know more about like in a few weeks, right? Clearly. However, we can already see signs of humanity, though, in a sense that the people who are in line to be vaccine first, right, those frontline workers and then people living in nursing homes. So we can see that even at this initial stage of discussion about distribution, the criteria that are used are not necessarily those of segmenting, but rather who are the people who can help first save lives, and how can we protect those people so that they can do their work. But of course, this is a story to tell, and probably in the next few days and weeks, we will know who really has access first. So we will just hope and that it will be based on equality, and then on human dignity, on the dignity of every human person, But again, we are living in a world where there is a gap between the ideal and the real. So we may hear conflicting stories in this sense. But
Alexei, I just wanted to follow up briefly. I think both Cole's question and my question perhaps point out that it's not sufficient just to promote the brute fact of religious freedom, if you will, but that there's a certain philosophy of religious freedom justified by the value of the individual, right? And Ganoon, you did talk about this, the inherent dignity of the individual, but that in promoting religious freedom, again, it's not just the brute fact of religious freedom, but the grounds of it, which then serve as grounds for other kinds of equality as well. It may seem a fine distinction, but I think it's an important one to recognize.
It is, and I think, and that should be even placed in the framework of the interrelatedness, right, and the interdependency of all freedoms. So it is not just religious freedom. I mean, and I'm here alluding to the Vienna Convention 1993, that all human rights are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. So of course, you will find intersections. Religious freedom is not just a standalone, right, value or principle, but it interacts with other rights, actually, and more foundationally with human dignity, as I was mentioning earlier. And yes, so definitely it touches socioeconomic issues and even cultural issues, racial, and you name it, in that sense.
One of the things that struck me, Ganoon, about the schema that you were laying out was to present religious freedom or freedom of conscience as deriving from solidarity. And to come back to the point that Jean-François Meyer ended on, this question of culture wars, seems to me that to a large degree, there's an opposition in the public debate between an idea of solidarity or an idea of equality and religious freedom often being presented as a form of selfishness or a form of individuality. Mm-hmm. And that reflects a broader polarization of politics around those poles of equality and freedom. And it seems to me that your schema offers a form of synthesis there.
Yeah. Well, the deeper issue is the refusal of one humanity. I think that's really one of the big hurdles, I mean, when we think about it, not only the segmenting, right, the hierarchicalization of the human family, but the refusal of the one human family to begin with, because this is the root cause of then afterwards of contempt against part of humanity. So this is why I think to restore freedom of conscience, to its rightful place can be part of the tools to help heal, those divides precisely that then translate in so many forms in society and so forth.
I see that Nick and James Christie are having a debate in the chat, and I think we should come to that at some point. But I wanted to come to Jean-François Meilleur. One of the things, I was struck when you were talking about the importance of informal negotiation between religion and state. And there's some contrast with what we were seeing with Louis Léon, and also with the Spanish case, where there were cases of relative tension in different country cases. Is that, do you think that's an important, would you say that having a space for informal negotiation, is that perhaps a solution or perhaps a panacea for some of the issues of religious illiteracy on behalf of state actors that Louis Léon pointed out?
Well, I would definitely claim that it is an important element, because when you have information coming directly from a person you're acquainted with, I mean, necessarily you will pay more attention. What was striking to me was to see how a number of decisions, not only in the time of the pandemic, but generally affecting religious freedom, are sometimes not malevolent, but maybe the result of indeed just widespread ignorance. And I think the example I quoted from the Swiss Federal Health Authorities was typically something of that kind. Just somebody, some official who was in charge of writing rules, and not consider at all that communion might be something actually quite important for celebrating Catholic Mass. And so why did I mention that? It was because, I came to that official member of the staff of a Swiss diocese with the idea, okay, what are the formal discussions going on? What are the channels? And for him, that was not the question. It worked, but without any kind of official channel. Okay, this probably cannot work at a much larger size, but still, I think it's significant. And regarding another question that was raised before about, the Council of State being more Catholic than the Catholic bishops. It's interesting that in the article by Berkmans, he quotes, I don't have the article in front of me, but he quotes a similar court case, a similar decision in Bavaria, apparently. And exactly, he stresses that basically Catholic, an individual Catholic, because it was again about Catholics, cannot go to court to force the church to resume services. And indeed, I hadn't considered that aspect, but definitely this is important too. The fact that sometimes churches were proactive. In some cases, they suspended, in some dioceses, for instance, in France, they suspended services before they were forced to do that. So at the same time, keeping some agency, but also this means that you may have faithful who are dissatisfied with the bishop because he suspended services even when he wasn't asked to do it. And obviously, an individual Catholic shouldn't be able to go to court to ask the bishop to resume services. Okay, it's a little bit a funny side story, but still, I think it raises also not insignificant issues.
Certainly within the Catholic case, one of the things it points out is internal tensions, long-standing internal tensions between bishops and certain portions of the laity. Yeah. Alejandro, Cole Durham asked a question whether you could elaborate on questionable uses of law that you had pointed out at the beginning.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
So Cole Durham had asked whether you could give some examples of questionable uses of law to justify restrictions.
Yes. Well, it has been a discussed matter about only in Spain and Portugal, as far as long I know, because yes, we are speaking about human rights, no, like religious freedom, and many of the restrictions that have a right to this human right to the religious freedom has been through some rules that are not suitable for it. I mean, in many European legal systems, we know that dealing with human rights can be done only through the highest level rules, for example, an act or a ley in Spanish, ley in Portuguese, a legge in Italiano, no? In Italian, no? But we are finding that many of the limitations or restrictions of religious freedom are coming through other rules that are under these highest rules. So through other kinds of rules, such as decrees, royal decrees, orders of the ministry, and so on, no, without a higher law that allow to the state to deal religious freedom in this way. So in some countries, for example, in Portugal and in Spain, the legal doctrine has asked for a modification of the higher laws, the higher rules, in order to let the state to touch some expressions, the place of the religious freedom, no? And we can add that, for example, in Spain, the state of alarm is going to last until May or June of the 2021. And in the meanwhile, the parliament is is working on several very important acts, such as educational, the reform, or doing a new educational act. It's a very important matter, education, and so important that it is not good that this new act is approved, is enacted in the middle of this state of alarm. So, it is a misguidance use of the hierarchy of the use in every state. These are some examples.
Alexei, we probably do need to bring this to an end for our break. If you'd like to have a final word, perhaps, or we can go to the break.
I think, well, I'd rather leave it if there's some closing remarks that somebody would like to add.
Well, I think I just may go. We've gone a few minutes into the break period already, and I do want to allow people to have at least 20 minutes.
Sure.
So I have been asked by my tech person, if when you take your break, please don't disconnect, just mute and turn your video off. And then when you come back in 20 minutes, just turn it on. And so we're not going to have to re-let everyone back from the waiting room. So 20 minutes from now at noon, we will start the panel. We'll move to North America, where there'll be some interesting comparisons, which we have just been discussed in Europe, and especially on the very recent Supreme Court case. So please come back for those stimulating conversations and discussions, and perhaps we can also engage with some of what we've already talked about and continue that. So thank you, Alexei and panel, and we'll see you all in 20 minutes.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, welcome back to our session. We are happy to, I know we have some new faces who've come on board to the International Conference on COVID-19 Pandemic and Religious Freedom, reports from North America and Europe. I'm Nicholas Miller, the director of the Andrews University International Religious Liberty Institute, one of the organizers of the meeting, along with BYU and the Law School Center for Law and Religion and the University of Portsmouth. And earlier you heard from Brett Scharfs and Alexei De Ferrari from the University of Portsmouth. There was two other individuals I need to mention. Cole Durham, also connected with BYU, has been very involved in our planning committee. And the fifth person, Rosa Maria Martinez de Codes of the University of Complutense in Madrid. And they also have been involved in the planning and shaping of this. And tomorrow we will hear more directly from Rosa Maria, as she is the chair of one of our panels. But now we are moving on to the report from North America, session 1, which I have the privilege of chairing. And just to bring you up to speed, if people have PowerPoints, they'll be sharing the screen and showing those, but if you'll also send them to me or send them to the whole group in the chat if you like, but be sure and send them to me as well so we can have them on our website. And we will also have the papers from the conference hopefully up within the next week, as well as a longer term publication. I would just like to introduce my panelists in the order of their presentation. First of all, we're going to hear from Christopher Lund, who is professor of law at Wayne State University Law School, where he works in the area of religious liberty with a special focus on religious institutions. His works and books, articles have been cited in the US Supreme Court, and he'll be looking at quarantines, religious groups, and some questions about equality. Following Professor Lund will be Kathleen Brady. She's a senior fellow and McDonald Distinguished Fellow with the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, and is currently a participating scholar with the Religious Freedom Institute's project on the freedom of religious institutions in society. Her scholarship focuses on the intersection of law and religion, including the First Amendment, religion in public life, law and theology, and Catholic social thought. And she'll be speaking on COVID-19 and restrictions on religious institutions, the constitutional implications, and of course, I'm sure we'll hear some interesting things about last week's Supreme Court case, and probably from our other presenters as well. I believe I haven't seen Andrew Lewis and Daniel Bennett online yet, but I bet they're going to be there because they sent me a paper. Andrew Lewis is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati.
They're both with us.
Okay, excellent. He is a public fellow with PRRI. He researches the intersection of law, religion, and American politics, and is the author of The Right Turn in Conservative Christian Politics, published by Cambridge in 2017. Daniel Bennett is an associate professor of political science at John Brown University, and his research and teaching interests are at the intersection of politics, law, and religion in the United States. And they'll be talking about church closures, religious freedom, and the coronavirus pandemic, assessing the Christian legal movement's response. And then finally, batting cleanup will be Caroline Corbin, who is professor of law and a Dean's Distinguished Scholar at the University of Miami School of Law. And her scholarship focuses on the First Amendment speech and religion clauses, particularly their intersection with equality issues. And she recently published a version of her presentation as Religious Liberty in a Pandemic in the Duke Law Journal. So with no further ado, Professor Lund, we look forward to hearing from you and the rest of our panelists. Let's see if we can, okay, good.
Yeah.
Looks like
I'm always talking when I'm muted in Zoom. So thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here. I don't know if my talk is fits best as the lead off, but you're accommodating me because I unfortunately have another commitment. So thank you for that. So when the government imposes quarantine orders for public safety, leaving some things and shutting some things down and leaving some things open, it raises a natural question, right? How are religious organizations going to be treated? And one response is that they should be treated equally. And that's a good response, or it's a good start. It captures a lot of intuitions. But equality is not self-defining and it's not self-executing. And the deeper you go into these quarantine orders, the more I think that becomes clear, right? With these quarantine orders, we want to treat religion equally. Legislatures, governors, courts. In the Supreme Court, for example, all 9 justices have been operating on the idea of equality, but they disagree about what equality means and how equality works. I'm working on a longer piece that goes into some of these details. If you're interested in it, let me know. I think the more you look at this, the more sort of fascinating and difficult questions emerge. In my short time here, I want to convince you of 2 things. First, the quarantine schemes require the government, inevitably, to make judgments about the value of religious exercise. And that's uncomfortable in a system like ours, which really tries to keep the government away from making such religious judgments. And second, quarantine schemes flatten religious difference in a number of uncomfortable ways, right? We need to decide how much we're going to restrict religious services. We do so by imagining what usually happens in a religious service. But when we imagine what happens in a regular religious service, it ends up, our image is naturally that of something like a Sunday morning Christian worship service. You know, the rules apply to all religious groups, but they were crafted with a certain idea of religion in mind, and that's natural, probably inevitable, but it raises some concerns. So my first point, quarantine schemes require the government to make judgments about how much religion or how much religious exercise is worth. Let me set the stage. So states in the American system have worked against COVID-19 in a variety of ways. Many states have issued shutdown orders requiring businesses and other organizations, including religious organizations, to close temporarily. And these shutdown orders work by categories and stages. Some organizations can stay open, others have to close. Certain rules like capacity limits will apply to some organizations and not others. Often this works in stages, right? This kind of business can open now, this kind of business can reopen later. Forget religion for a second. Forget religion, forget religious organizations for a second. You know, if in general you were in charge of deciding what should open and what should close and when and how, you would naturally take into account the value of the thing in question, right? States have different but overlapping ideas about essential businesses, which never had to close, right? Grocery stores, hospitals, lawyers' offices, and liquor stores. But you know, you decide what's an essential business by deciding what's essential, right? By deciding what's too important to close. And grocery stores and hospitals are just too important to close. Maybe I'm less sure about lawyers' offices. You know, but these value judgments aren't just in what's in essential businesses. California had a 4-stage reopening plan. California put restaurants in stage 2B, and it put bars in stage 3. Restaurants got to open up before bars. Now, that could be purely about the relative risk of COVID transmission in restaurants and bars, but I doubt that a little, given what was said and given also that social distancing and masks were required in both places. I also think, looking at a little bit, there's a value judgment there, right? California thinks, and maybe it has good reason to think, that restaurants are just more important than bars, so those 22-year-olds can drink someplace else. And more generally, value judgments lie behind a lot of these categorization decisions, right? Grocery stores are essential because people need to buy food, and we fear a lot of people don't have easy access or money for grocery delivery. Childcare places often get put first in the category of businesses that can reopen. Childcares get to reopen early, we think, not because kids are super hygienic, but because we know working parents need childcare for their kids. So my point is this, you know, we must listen to the scientists who can tell us about comparative transmission risk, but we also need someone to tell us about the comparative value of these things. You know, and that creates the issue. Usually people get to make their own judgments about the value of religion in our system, right? People might think religion valuable, they might think it invaluable, they might think it worthless. They make their own decisions and the government doesn't. But now we're affecting each other more than before. And now we have to make these collective, that is governmental decisions, essentially about the worth of religion or religious exercise. And let me be clear, I think it has to be this way. I mean, I think we're stuck with classifying organizations by type and then trying to figure out where to put religious organizations. And I think it has to be this way because I think the alternatives are worse. Imagine the government unable to classify organizations by type, right? Imagine the government only being able to use generally applicable rules like 6 feet apart, indoor masks, buildings at 50% capacity. If that's all the government could do, if the government could only use those kinds of rules, it wouldn't be able to distinguish between organizations at all. It couldn't distinguish between non-religious organizations. It couldn't favor restaurants over bars. It couldn't favor grocery stores or hospitals or daycares. The government has to be able to favor groceries and hospitals. And that means we're stuck trying to figure out where religious organizations fit in a kind of secular taxonomy, which means we're stuck with the government deciding the value of religious service, exercise. And I think this cuts a lot of different ways. I mean, religious exercise, I tend to think, should be given a high priority. I'm a supporter of free exercise and religious exemptions in general. Religious exemptions should be given a high priority, but how high and high by what measure? These questions don't answer themselves. Let me give you an example. The Supreme Court had a case recently, Calvary Chapel. It's one of the 3 court cases the Supreme Court had on this. Calvary Chapel involved Nevada's scheme. Nevada had reopened casinos, and Nevada had this rule that churches, synagogues, and mosques, religious organizations could have a maximum of 50 people in them, but casinos could have up to 50% of their maximum capacity. So, a 50-person rule wouldn't work in a casino. So Nevada changed it. Casinos could have up to 50% of their maximum occupancy, which is thousands of people. And casinos are like religious organizations in a way that relates to risk transmission. People stay at casinos for hours. They don't typically stay at grocery stores for hours, but churches and casinos maybe have that in common. Anyway, a number of justices thought this unconstitutional, thought that this devalued religious exercise. There is no world, Justice Gorsuch said, in which the Constitution allows Nevada to favor Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel. And I think that idea makes a lot of sense, right? Nevada's making a value judgment that casinos are more important than churches, that economic considerations are more important than religious ones. And I get that. I think it makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, think about the other side, right? Nevada gets 20% of its annual revenue, 20% of Nevada's annual budget revenue from casinos. That's true for casinos. It's not true for churches. What do we do with that fact, right? What does it mean, right? Casinos bring in $2 billion a year to Nevada's state treasury. Nevada presumably needs that money to fix the roads and keep the school going and help low-income folks who need it, right? Casinos are worth $2 billion to Nevada. Are churches worth that much? Are they worth less? Are they worth more? How does one even begin to answer that question? But that is the question, right? How much are churches worth? That's the question at the bottom of all of this. It's a question we never want the government to answer explicitly, but implicitly, it's laying behind all of these decisions. And of course, by churches, I don't just mean churches. I mean churches, synagogues, mosques, all kinds of religious organizations. And let me say, this isn't about courts versus legislatures. It doesn't matter who's in charge of deciding. Whoever's in charge of deciding, whether it's courts or legislatures or governors, you have to deal with this problem, and it's intractable. So that's my first point. The second point I want to make, so the first point, quarantine schemes require governments to make decisions about the value of religion or the value of religious exercise. The second point, quarantine schemes flatten religious difference in some uncomfortable ways, and this will be shorter. Look into the reasons that people give for classifying religious organizations where they do in the secular taxonomy. Look at decisions of legislatures or governors. Look at the arguments in the litigated cases. Look into the judgments of transmission risk. Look into their judgments of transmission risk within religious organizations and religious services, right? This is everywhere. There's a lot of talk about super spreader events based on religious services that have happened, which is obviously a huge concern. But if you read the literature that judges and legislatures and governors are relying on, you see implicitly conceptions about what religious gatherings are like. For example, in the literature, you see a lot of discussion about singing, for example, which makes sense. There's a lot of risk with singing. And if you look at the expert testimony in these cases and the legislative and gubernatorial judgments and the judicial decisions, you get a certain image about what happens at a religious service. An image that doesn't, of course, capture the complexity of American religion, right? Not all faiths sing during worship services. Some faiths don't really have worship services, right? We're figuring out what restrictions to impose on religious services generally using a baseline conception of what happens usually at a religious service, but that conception is shaped heavily by the practice of the dominant majority faith. To put it bluntly, these quarantines have been regulating all faiths as if all religious meetings resemble Sunday morning Christian worship services. I don't think it's terribly surprising. I don't even think it's avoidable. Every society has a cultural understanding of what religious worship looks like, and those are going to inform law. But I do think it's a concern, or at least it's a curiosity, to see genuine religious differences being flattened in this way, and to see all religious organizations governed by rules that were really designed with Protestant worship services in mind. Anyway, that's my time. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you're a very efficient professor. I think you actually have a couple of minutes left if you would like them, but we could save it for question and answer, I suppose.
I'm good, because what happens in this situation is now you're going to give me 2 minutes and then I'm going to take 8 and then you're going to, I'd rather just stop now.
Thanks for the fair warning. I do appreciate that. And I think Kathleen Brady is wrestling with her camera a bit.
Nick, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, you know what? I'm afraid that you'll be able to, I could wrestle all the next hour. I'm not sure why the camera's not working, but if you hear me, can I just go ahead, or do you want me to still try to figure out what's going on?
That would be fine. Go ahead with your paper, Professor.
Yeah, and maybe
Brady.
by the time we get to, question and answer, I'll figure it out, but I'm not sure.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you very much. When the dangers of COVID-19 first became apparent to the American public in March, few churches resisted state and local lockdown orders that prohibited or severely limited in-person worship services. The potential for congregational gatherings to rapidly spread the virus was widely understood, and most religious believers probably anticipated a relatively short disruption. However, litigation began to increase as states implemented reopening plans, and religious groups challenged rules that they viewed as impermissibly favoring non-religious forms of gathering over religious worship. For example, in a case that reached the Supreme Court on an application for emergency injunctive relief in July, a rural Nevada church argued that the state violated the free exercise clause when its reopening plan capped indoor worship services at 50 people, but allowed casinos, bars, restaurants, and gyms to open at 50% of building capacity, regardless of the total number of people assembled. The court in Calvary Chapel denied the church's application for relief over strong dissents joined by 4 of the court's conservative justices, and the case and others like it continued in the lower courts. Now, with COVID-19 infections spiking, many American jurisdictions are tightening restrictions on secular and religious gatherings, and some religious groups have begun to challenge new rules that place severe restrictions on in-person worship. Last week, the Supreme Court granted applications for emergency injunctive relief brought by a Catholic diocese and several Orthodox Jewish entities challenging tight caps on in-person worship in COVID hotspots in New York. According to the court in Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, the 10 and 25 person limits on houses of worship in areas designated as red and orange zones favored secular activities over religious practice and failed to satisfy the strict scrutiny required of discriminatory action under the free exercise clause. The distinctions drawn in New York's rules were less clearly discriminatory than those in Nevada's reopening plan. Certainly, the replacement of Justice Ginsburg with Justice Barrett tipped the balance on the court in favor of the dissenters in Calvary Chapel. However, there were also signs that those who joined the majority were moving away from requiring a clear showing of discriminatory treatment before applying heightened scrutiny to significant restrictions on religious worship. The court's move away from a focus on discrimination towards close scrutiny of all worship restrictions is the right one, but the majority neither acknowledged this shift nor signaled a new framework or approach that would explain or guide it. I will argue that the appropriate framework for analyzing restrictions on religious worship is the doctrine of church autonomy that's been emerging in the court's recent religion clause jurisprudence. Throughout the pandemic, the chief claim of religious litigants has been that COVID-19 restrictions that they challenge impermissibly discriminate against religious worship in favor of secular activities. Demands for equal treatment have intuitive appeal, and they also fit with the Supreme Court's current religion clause jurisprudence. Under the court's precedents, if a religious plaintiff can show that a law burdening religious practice is not neutral or not generally applicable, the law is subject to the strictest scrutiny. The government must then demonstrate that the application of its rule to the believer is the least restrictive means of achieving a compelling state interest. The court has explained that laws are not neutral if they target religious practice, and they're not generally applicable if the state pursues its interests only against religious conduct or leaves unregulated substantial secular conduct that undermines the state's interest to the same or greater degree. Religious plaintiffs typically argue that COVID-19 restrictions fail both of these standards. Rules that specify limitations on in-person worship that are stricter than restrictions that apply to comparable secular activities target religion, and they're not generally applicable. There are a number of drawbacks to approaches that focus on equal treatment. One is the difficulty of identifying the appropriate benchmarks for determining whether COVID-19 restrictions discriminate against religion. Religious plaintiffs, government officials, and judges frequently disagree about what these benchmarks should be. For example, in Diocese of Brooklyn, Justice Sotomayor and Kagan argued that New York's rules treated religious worship better than comparative secular activities because stricter rules applied to secular gatherings like movies, theaters, and concerts. The justices agreed with the state that the relevant comparisons to religious worship were gatherings where a large number of people arrive simultaneously, congregate for extended periods of time, and leave together. The justices in the majority pointed instead to activities like shopping in grocery and hardware stores, using laundromats, and congregating in transportation facilities, all of which were identified by the state as essential and not capped. Certainly, worship services would be riskier than grocery shopping without masks, social distancing, and limitations on singing. However, most religious congregations, including the plaintiffs in Diocese of Brooklyn, comply with state and local safety rules, and many, like the diocese, have developed far more rigorous safety plans. The plaintiffs in Diocese of Brooklyn also didn't object to New York's pre-existing rules limiting worship service to 33% of church or synagogue capacity, and the diocese had been using a more restrictive limit of 25% of building capacity in its churches. It's not clear how we should evaluate the relative safety of church services and grocery shopping when congregants are masked, distanced, and meeting at 33% of building capacity, and an unlimited number of people could be shopping on a busy day. The fact that most COVID-19 limitations on religious worship are also part of a complex series of proscriptions and prescriptions further complicates the identification of appropriate benchmarks for evaluating claims of religious discrimination. This was the case with the reopening plan at issue in Calvary Chapel. Nevada had detailed a series of rules that applied a range of restrictions to many different kinds of activities that can transmit COVID-19, and varying occupancy limits were just part of those rules. Moreover, religious congregations usually are not actually asking for equal treatment. While those in the majority in Diocese of Brooklyn identified comparable secular activities to be essential businesses like grocery shopping, pet stores, and transportation, the plaintiffs didn't demand the same unlimited occupancy that New York's rules allow in these contexts. They only contested the 10 and 25 person caps that applied to houses of worship in red and orange zones, and the Supreme Court's injunction was limited to those restrictions. Similarly, the church in Calvary Chapel didn't really want to be governed by the same rules as Nevada's casinos. It demanded the right to hold in-person worship services with the same occupancy limits as casinos, but it developed its own safety plan that was in many ways more restrictive than the rules that apply to commercial entities. What most religious congregations want is to maximize their ability to meet together safely in person. As states reopened and time passed, religious believers grew concerned that their institutions were being left behind, even as our improving understanding of how the virus spreads made it possible to have safer forms of larger gathering. Now that COVID-19 cases are spiking, some religious believers, like the plaintiffs in Diocese of Brooklyn, object to blunt rules that they view as unnecessarily restrictive, even as many of the activities of daily life continue. Religious congregations are making important fairness claims. They want their religious needs to be treated with at least as much urgency as commercial and recreational interests, and they view them as essential as food, transportation, and healthcare. But religious congregations are not necessarily envisioning the same rules as those for non-religious entities. They're not, in fact, asking for equal treatment, but they are asking for the type of heightened scrutiny that applies when courts find religious discrimination. Indeed, those in the majority in Diocese of Brooklyn also seem less focused on equal treatment than on remedying the loose fit between New York's objectives and its religious restrictions. While those in the majority argued that New York's rules discriminated against religion, most of their comparisons to essential activities that are uncapped seem strained. With safety rules, worship services might be comparable to garages, grocery stores, and laundromats, as I just discussed. But those in the majority didn't go into this detail or respond to obvious objections to their comparability. It's certainly far less clear that New York's rules discriminated against religion than Nevada's more lenient treatment of casinos, restaurants, and gyms. The real concern of those in the majority in Diocese of Brooklyn has become the religious restrictions themselves. What mattered most to them about New York's rules was that the state had placed severe restrictions on worship that were not narrowly tailored. The court was right, but it didn't admit its shift or signal the principle or doctrine that could explain it. Instead of focusing on discrimination, a better starting point is to focus on what is at stake in conflicts over COVID-19 restrictions. Government restrictions on in-person worship services interfere with one of the most fundamental aspects of religious practice. For most of America's faiths, regular in-person worship services are indispensable, and indeed they're the lifeblood of the religious community. In recent decisions, the Supreme Court has begun to articulate a doctrine of church autonomy with protections for religious institutions that don't depend on the existence of religious discrimination, and this doctrine should extend to disputes over congregational worship. This July, the court wrote that the First Amendment affords religious institutions freedom over faith and doctrine and interrelated matters of church government essential to the institution's central mission. The court spoke of a sphere of autonomy protected from state intrusion by both the free exercise and establishment clauses. The court has only begun to fill in the contours of this freedom, and its holdings so far are limited. But religious worship is clearly a matter at the core of a church's religious mission, and decisions about congregational worship belong within the scope of church autonomy. Of course, church autonomy can't be a principle without limits, and conflicts over COVID-19 restrictions test the limits of this freedom. These are exceptional circumstances where the state clearly has a compelling interest in protecting public health. But this interest doesn't give governments unbounded power. The principle of church autonomy requires government officials to carefully tailor their rules to maximize the ability of congregations to meet safely in person. Careful tailoring means that officials must continuously evaluate and update their rules in light of new information about the virus and how it spreads. They also have to consider the experiences of other jurisdictions with less restrictive rules for worship, as well as the effects of more lenient treatment of commercial or recreational activities on public safety. Numerical or other limits on church attendance must be justified with precision and scientific support, and when it's possible to increase attendance with safety precautions, government regulations must reflect this. As recent spikes in COVID-19 infections make clear, in an evolving public health crisis, governments have to have the flexibility to respond to rapidly changing circumstances and the room to take proactive steps if conditions worsen. Governments should be permitted to err on the side of safety, particularly at the outset of a crisis or in deteriorating circumstances, but the level of caution must match their stance with respect to activities that they view as essential. For religious believers, worship practices nourish life just as food does, and the protections of the religion clauses in the American Constitution reflect the value that religion has for believers. The same rules need not apply to churches and grocery stores, but governments must make the same efforts to maximize the ability of religious believers to worship together in person as they do to keep other essential functions open. Narrow tailoring of restrictions on protected activities is a requirement of strict scrutiny whenever it applies, but the principle of church autonomy demands more. This principle reflects the view that church and state are, at least in matters essential to religious mission, separate spheres with distinctive purposes and unique governing structures. Church and state often interact, but when they do, the independence of each must be recognized and respected. In the context of COVID-19, this means that religious leaders and government officials both have a role to play in developing the restrictions that apply to worship. Government officials must communicate with religious leaders and give them an opportunity to provide input as decisions are made and rules are evaluated and adjusted. Religious congregations must also be given the opportunity to submit their own plans for safely handling COVID-19 risks in their communities. And these plans should be evaluated in a timely manner, and rejections must be explained and justified. Spikes in COVID-19 infections may call for new communication and new plans, but governments must respect the role and responsibilities of religious leaders in their own communities. Government officials and religious leaders must be partners in addressing the risks of COVID-19 because both have critical interests at stake. Effective partnerships also build trust and increase the investment of religious believers in safety measures.
Kathleen,
New
you
York's
have about
governor.
a minute and a half left.
Okay, I've got to do it. New York's governor tied rising infection rates in many of the state's hotspots to the failure on the part of many in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community to follow existing rules, and he announced his new rules against the backdrop of his frustration. However, heavy-handed responses that don't involve the affected communities only deepen suspicions and make resistance more likely. Establishing partnerships that build trust will not always be easy, but if religious adherents believe that their governments recognize the urgencies of their concerns and will work with them to mitigate the effect of the virus on their faith lives, all of our communities will be safer and more stable. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. Very, very interesting and timely as well. So we now move on to our paper that is partnered. We have two presenters, we're dividing the time between them. Professor Andrew Lewis and Daniel Bennett. I'm not sure which one goes first. I'll let you choose.
We drafted it together, but Dr. Bennett is going to, Dan Bennett's going to go first, going to actually handle it, and so we don't have to go back and forth.
Yeah, I'll be taking this part, and Dr. Lewis will come in for the Q&A later on. Well, thanks very much. I think this has been, I'm speaking for myself, but I think also for Professor Lewis, just a really interesting conversation. We're political scientists. This isn't usually the types of conversations that we're engaged in typically. So I've learned a lot over the past couple of events, and looking forward to the remainder. But as political scientists, one of the things that we're interested in is exploring the political implications of some of these questions, particularly how people's perceptions of legal ideas and issues like religious freedom, like free exercise jurisprudence, actually plays out in practice. And so I know Dr. Lewis can talk about this later in the Q&A. He has some really interesting research on how religious freedom has become really just another culture war issue that can be predictably observed through the lens of partisanship and ideology and other things. And so that's problematic enough when we think about the practical implications of what that would lead to in terms of a constitutionally guaranteed right. But then you throw in the coronavirus pandemic and it's a public health crisis, and it leads to so many more issues and complications. And that's really the intersection and the area in which we're writing here. So during the earliest days of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States, many state and local governments enacted restrictions on large gatherings in an effort to slow the spread of the virus. Restaurants were closed, concerts and sporting events canceled, store capacities limited, and Sunday worship services halted. It was a sudden and seismic shift in the American way of life. And religious Americans generally complied with orders pertaining to worship services, but many also expressed concerns about such regulations of religious life. Across several national surveys, white evangelicals were more likely than others to support churches defying government restrictions. Moreover, there were clear partisan gaps coinciding with support or opposition to these restrictions. One study linked defiant attitudes to whether states had either no restrictions or strong restrictions, and another study connected defiance to trust in Fox News. So in general, the politics of COVID restrictions on churches reflect the growing polarization of religious freedom, one that is poised to play a major role in the future, and in many ways current culture war battles. As such, there are two often simultaneous conversations going on, one legal, which is what we've been talking about this morning, and another political, which of course affects the legal conversation. So while most places of worship transitioned, some easily and some with greater difficulty, to online or distanced outdoor meetings to meet the requirements of local ordinances and recommendations. Others fought back. Some churches argued that these orders violated their rights under the First Amendment. Some went so far as saying that these orders were evidence of persecution toward people of faith and ought to be opposed not just for legal reasons, but also for moral and theological ones. As churches began to challenge and object to restrictions on worship services, several groups affiliated with the Christian legal movement joined the fray. So Liberty Counsel jumped in on the defense of a Virginia pastor who faced penalties for continuing to hold in-person church gatherings in violation of state orders. Alliance Defending Freedom represented 2 churches who sued Oregon's governor for maintaining restrictions. And First Liberty Institute won a temporary restraining order against a Kentucky policy limiting in-person services. Now, the details constituting these legal fights are obviously different across venues, but the churches at the center of these disputes tend to make a similar argument. State orders regulating houses of worship differently than other entities, or in some cases even regulating them at all, run afoul of the First Amendment. And this is an argument Christian legal groups are more than happy to make. At the same time, when appealing to a wider audience, these groups often stoke the fears of culture wars over religious freedom. This two-pronged dialogue has in-group advantages, of course, but it may also hamper efforts to build useful and necessary coalitions in order to vouchsafe stable religious liberty jurisprudence in the years to come. One of the earliest legal challenges to pandemic-related restrictions took place in Virginia after the pastor of Lighthouse Fellowship was cited for holding an in-person service with 16 people, and this exceeded the 10-person limit set by the Commonwealth. Liberty Counsel represented the church, focusing its arguments on the religious freedom rights of the church and the pastor. Core to the legal argument was that Virginia exempted essential retail businesses from the 10-person limitation, but did not do so for religious gatherings. Requiring church meetings to abide by the 10-person limitation resulted in, quote, discriminatory restrictions on religious worship services. Now, at the same time, Liberty Counsel's legal approach stoked anger over perceived government persecution of churches. Appearing before the Fourth Circuit, Liberty Counsel argued that Virginia's governor, and I'm quoting here, continued to place his thumb on houses of worship. Liberty Counsel also praised the Trump administration for the Department of Justice's involvement, as well as Vice President Pence's statements of support, elevating the administration's support for religious freedom in the face of discrimination. It is reassuring, declared Matt Staver, the founder of Liberty Counsel, to have an administration that supports religious freedom. This pattern of coupling legal defense with culture war politics was present among other Christian legal groups as well. In the spring, First Liberty Institute defended churches in Kentucky opposing Governor Andy Beshear's restrictions. The lawsuit emphasized the church's religious freedom and assembly rights under the federal and state constitutions. Simultaneously, First Liberty used the events to elevate religious freedom threats and polarize conservatives against liberals. Debates over public health restrictions on churches were described as a, quote, all-out war on faith. The legal group also claimed to have exposed the, quote, real agenda of our opponents to keep our churches shut down indefinitely and attack religious freedom in America. The American Center for Law and Justice, meanwhile, also emphasized the polarization of religious freedom to promote its work, arguing that, quote, extremists on the left are using the coronavirus as an excuse to attack Christians. These polarizing claims found favor with certain members of Republican leadership and government. While the CDC issued measured guidance for churches considering holding in-person services, President Trump emphasized political division, leveraging religious freedom rhetoric for political gain. On May 22nd, President Trump mirrored the arguments of Christian legal groups about churches being excluded from essential status, declaring that if governors do not allow churches to open immediately, he would, quote, override the governors. In August, Trump told the Catholic news cable network EWTN that Democrats are using coronavirus to, quote, put the churches out of business. And at the Republican National Convention over the summer, Donald Trump Jr. summarized this approach. People of faith are under attack, he said. You're not allowed to go to church, but mass chaos in the streets gets a pass. This is, of course, in response to the protests over racial injustice and police brutality. Polarizing religious freedom comes at a cost. For one thing, while the public was predictably divided over these issues, Legal actions and rhetoric in some cases have obscured legitimate concerns where religious congregations were overburdened. This rhetoric made divisions divisive. For example, earlier this summer, a Nevada church challenged state restrictions limiting indoor church gatherings to 50 persons, as was mentioned just a bit ago, while restricting much larger venues such as casinos to 50% capacity. Though the Supreme Court denied injunctive relief, the Nevada church has a far better legal argument than, say, John MacArthur's California megachurch, which has refused to abide by virtually any pandemic regulation, including those related to gathering size, mask wearing, and social distancing. Additionally, the polarization of religious freedom threatens to diminish the stark reality of the pandemic, potentially leading people of faith to downplay just how serious the health crisis is. MacArthur himself has repeatedly cast doubt on the seriousness of the situation, telling congregants in an August sermon that the numbers of COVID deaths are inflated, and then concluding there is no pandemic. Additionally, recent research shows a growing divide over the reasonableness of restrictions on churches during the pandemic, with partisanship and support for the prosperity gospel among the key drivers of this divide. So this marriage of religious freedom polarization and COVID denialism threatens to unnecessarily exacerbate the crisis during the upcoming winter months, just ahead of the supposed release of vaccines. These sorts of disputes and tensions have only amplified as the pandemic has raged on. Just last week, as people have alluded to, the Supreme Court weighed in on New York's restrictions on in-person worship, enjoining the 10 and 25 person limits on attendance and finding that these restrictions are likely to be unconstitutional upon closer review. Even in a pandemic, reads the court's per curiam opinion, the Constitution cannot be put away and forgotten. The restrictions at issue here, they continue, by effectively barring many from attending religious services, strike at the very heart of the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty. So even though the dissenting justices argue that the court's decision was both ignoring the government's concern for public health and unnecessary given recent changes to the policy, Justice Gorsuch memorably wrote that the restrictions treats houses of worship differently from their non-sectarian counterparts. Who knew, he facetiously asked, public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience? So Washington University's John Anazu agreed with the court's decision, yet played down its widespread importance, referring to it as a fairly fact-specific injunctive relief before adding, quote, "It's hard to generalize much from this decision, and I'm concerned that public messaging about it will fuel a broader culture wars narrative." And unfortunately, that's precisely what happened. Following the decision, Alliance Defending Freedom declared, "The Constitution forbids government officials from treating religious Americans like second-class citizens." While First Liberty Institute added, "Government officials may not abuse their emergency powers to discriminate against Americans of faith." And on the other side, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman tweeted, "The first major decision of the Trump-packed court, and naturally, it will kill people." While New York Governor Andrew Cuomo dismissed the court's ruling precisely because of Trump's Supreme Court appointments and the majority's conservative ideology. When churches and Christian legal groups challenge reasonable restrictions and link their efforts to partisan politics and cultural polarization, they hamper efforts to vouchsafe religious freedom writ large and build support for the broader cause. Legitimate questions are not only dwarfed by the propensity by some churches and advocacy groups to rebuff any government regulation, but such actions inhibit broader political support for religious freedom. And limited political support will, in time, diminish legal protections. Moreover, even when the courts invalidate problematic restrictions, advancing a culture war narrative connected to religious freedom only furthers this problematic divide. So churches and Christian legal groups may win smaller battles and garner immediate political support by fighting tooth and nail against even the most minute public health regulation, but this strategy does little to win the larger war for expanded religious freedom protections for all. And with that, I will leave it and return for Q&A if necessary.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that. And I do believe there will be some Q&A. Is Christopher Lund gone from the group? I think he has. He had to leave early, and I had wanted to give him a live question or two before he left. So we did have a discussion in the chat. Be sure that you pay attention to that. He's had some good interchanges with both myself and Alexis on a couple of questions we've had. So be sure and read that. But before we have our live discussion, we're hearing from one final presenter here for this session, Professor Caroline Corbin from the University of Miami Law School. Professor Corbin?
Hi. Well, thank you for having me here. So unfortunately, we do find ourselves in the midst of another surge, maybe even just the beginning, and a particularly devastating one in the United States. And in response, some states in the US are bringing back the bans on mass gatherings that were imposed earlier in the pandemic, as some people have noted. And by mass gathering ban, I mean government orders that bar any indoor gatherings of more than a certain number of people where people stay and sit for a long period of time. So for example, no indoor gatherings of more than 10 people in places like restaurants, bars, theaters, concert halls, indoor sports arenas, and houses of worship. And the question I address today is the one that everybody has on their mind, is whether it's constitutional to ban all mass gatherings above a certain size, including worship services, during the pandemic. And in particular, many American churches have argued that forbidding large in-person services violate their religious rights under the Free Exercise Clause. And the Free Exercise Clause is that clause in the First Amendment of the US Constitution that protects religious liberty. And I want to suggest that such bans can be perfectly constitutional. So the first question is, what standard of review should apply when evaluating a Free Exercise Clause challenge to a ban on mass gatherings? And some lower courts have argued that the emergency circumstances call for more deferential review of government public health measures. And these courts point to Jacobson versus Massachusetts, a Supreme Court decision from 1905 that upheld mandatory vaccinations during a smallpox epidemic. And this is a case that Chief Justice Roberts cited favorably when concurring with a Supreme Court decision that upheld COVID regulations. But in last week's Supreme Court decision on a different challenge to COVID limits, and a decision made after Amy Coney Barrett was appointed to the bench, the per curiam decision striking down New York's regulations made no mention of this case and seemed to prefer the sort of standard doctrine. And I actually agree with that. And so my analysis will also apply the standard constitutional doctrine. And I agree that too much deference invites the government to use or arguably misuse healthcare emergency as an excuse to curtail rights. Something we've seen, for example, with states trying to limit women's access to abortion during the pandemic. All right, so what's the standard constitutional doctrine for religious liberty challenges? The current constitutional rule is that neutral laws of general applicability do not violate the Free Exercise Clause. And a ban on all gatherings, secular and religious, easily meets the standard. A law is neutral if it does not intentionally target religion. A ban on all gatherings cannot be said to target religion. A law is generally applicable if it reaches all relevant conduct. In other words, a law wouldn't be generally applicable if it only limited religious gatherings, but not similar secular ones. A ban on all mass gatherings, again, doesn't seem to have that problem. Nonetheless, many churches respond that the state's restrictions did target religious conduct, but not analogous secular conduct, by barring worship services, but allowing activities deemed essential, like shopping at a supermarket or liquor store. These churches argue that different treatment of similar activities amounts to unconstitutional discrimination against religious gatherings. Of course, if these activities are not similar, if gathering at a church and shopping for food and drink are not comparable, then the free exercise claim would fail. It's not discrimination to treat different activities differently. So are they comparable? Are they counterparts? Some lower courts have tried to distinguish them by arguing shopping for food and drink is essential in a way that attending in-person religious services is not. And by essential, courts mean different things. Some courts mean that people simply could not physically live without it. That is, exempted activities like food shopping are required to literally survive in a way that going to church is not. Now, this conclusion arguably embeds a contested value judgment about what is essential to human flourishing. To valorize physical needs over spiritual ones may not adequately express everyone's priorities. Other courts have argued that the exempted activities are essential in the sense that there are no alternatives available. We must eat, yet most of us can't grow our own food and therefore have to go to a supermarket. For those who must worship, even assuming it's essential in that way, alternatives to in-church services abound. People may pray to their God on their own at home or together outside, online, or at drive-in services, or even inside in small groups. And to be sure, the experience is not exactly the same as large in-person fellowship, but little in our lives today is exactly the same. Now, there are rebuttals and counter-rebuttals to both these claims. Even if most religions do not mandate that worship take the form of large in-person gatherings, perhaps some do. And although people must buy food, why not have it delivered in person rather than go to the supermarket? Of course, the delivery argument assumes both the availability and the affordability of delivery services, which simply may not be the state of affairs for all people in all stores. Ultimately, whether the activities can be distinguished on the basis of essentialness does not matter, because they are distinguishable based on the health risks attached to them. That is, when it comes to the reason why the bans were imposed to limit the spread of the coronavirus, these activities are not comparable. The risk of spreading the coronavirus is much higher at worship services compared to shopping. And to understand why, a very quick review of what we know about the risk of contagion. Studies have established that people are contagious even before they exhibit symptoms. Studies also show that the coronavirus spreads mainly by person-to-person contact via droplets and aerosols. The World Health Organization advises people to avoid the 3 C's: confined and enclosed spaces, crowded places, and close contact settings. As a result, the risk of transmission are greatest in crowded indoor spaces where people are interacting with each other for longer periods of time. Singing and speaking also seem to be risk factors, and recent studies seem to suggest that speaking is almost as much of a risk as singing. Indeed, one of the most notable early outbreaks in the United States was traced to a choir rehearsal in a church. Even though the singers took care to apply hand sanitizer and observe social distancing, 53 out of 61 contracted COVID-19. In fact, religious services have been the vector for multiple coronavirus outbreaks. So one CDC study found that after 2 positive but asymptomatic worshipers attended church events, at least 35 out of 92 attendees fell ill, with 3 dying. Moreover, at least 26 more cases in the community could be traced to the outbreak, with another death. And these are people who did not attend the service in person. And every week brings report of churches serving as the locus of a super spreader event. There was one in North Carolina last month with 200 cases, another in Massachusetts also with 200 cases. My article for this cites to some more. The original article I write cites to even more examples. There are just so many other examples. In contrast, such clusters have not been traced to people shopping at stores. The nature of the activities just differ. First, the time spent in stores is much shorter. When people shop, they generally enter and leave as fast as they can. Services, in contrast, are extended affairs. A usual Sunday Catholic Mass takes at least an hour, and other services can be even longer. One plaintiff, one church that brought a lawsuit, their services lasted an hour and 45 minutes. And in one of those earlier, or one of the early Supreme Court cases where the court upheld regulations, Judge Kavanaugh in dissent complained, why can some safely walk down a grocery aisle but not a pew? And the answer is they can, but they do not. People sit in pews, not walk down them. Second, people in stores generally try to minimize their interactions as much as possible, a feat that's made easier by the ability to constantly move around. In contrast, the point of in-person religious services is to commune with one's fellow worshipers. So even when social distancing, congregants are still often in a crowded room, perhaps with questionable ventilation, filled with people all around them. Moreover, the fellow worshipers surrounding them are speaking and even singing for extended periods of time. Such an experience with the accompanying exposure to droplets and aerosols potentially carrying the virus makes religious services a particularly high-risk activity. And not surprisingly, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health rated the contact intensity of shopping as low, but the contact intensity of places of worship as high. Thus, a trip to the liquor store and attendance at religious services are not comparable, not when you take into account the science of how the coronavirus is spread. A final note, my analysis does assume that bans cover all large indoor gatherings, including gatherings inside restaurants, bars, and other places where people interact for a prolonged period of time. So to exempt restaurants or casinos, but not houses of worship, definitely weakens the state's defense. However, it does not necessarily defeat them. Even assuming some dissimilar treatment of similar conduct, it remains an open question whether all deviations amounts to discrimination against religion. So to allow all mass gatherings except religious worship inexorably leads to the conclusion that the point of that law was to burden religious exercise. It's harder to insist on that conclusion when not only religious gatherings are banned, but a long list of secular gatherings as well, even if a few secular counterparts are permitted. Still, the strongest bans comprehensively ban indoor gatherings. And if they do, then there is no reason constitutionally to exclude houses of worship. So in conclusion, the current science suggests that crowded indoor spots where people talk, sing, and socialize for an extended period of time are high risk and potential super spreader events. While that generally does not describe people at their local supermarket or liquor store or bicycle shop, it does describe religious services. The bottom line then is that mass gatherings and shopping are not analogous in terms of risk. Accordingly, disparate treatment of these dissimilar activities does not indicate discrimination and therefore does not defeat the requirement of neutrality and general applicability. Based on science, these activities are not comparable in terms of risk. Therefore, based on the law, mass gathering bans are not unconstitutional. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. A very thoughtful and insightful analysis, and done in a very timely fashion too, the perfect combination. And you've stirred up a lot of discussion in the chat room. And so in fact, since we have your presentation fresh in mind, maybe we should start with some of those questions. I think that Cole kicked it off, although actually John Ashmead's, oh no, Cole's question was first, and he was asking, Caroline's analysis rests on Smith. Would you reach the same result applying RFRA or state RFRAs? And I kind of had a corollary to that, pointing out that there are, usually they just don't ban mass gatherings. There's different kinds of activities, and churches usually are mentioned and put in zone 3 or zone 2 or something. And so they're mentioned. Does that stop it from being truly neutral and awaken the strict scrutiny test? So both of those questions are related.
Okay, so I heard the question about singling out churches for mention. And first I'll say that actually not all bans on mass gatherings mention churches separately. Maybe they include them as an example in their list of things that are banned, but they're usually not singled out. And when they are singled out, they're often singled out for more favorable treatment, which was actually the case in New York City. So I actually have the regulations before me. And so in the red zone, restaurants are completely closed for indoor dining. So they're shut in their entirety. And non-essential and other gatherings are also completely shut. They're not allowed at all. So the only mass gatherings that are allowed are churches, and they're singled out because they get better treatment than the other gatherings that are completely banned. So I don't think you can argue that an attempt to give favorable treatment to a religious organization is the fact that's going to defeat neutrality and general applicability. And this is a point that Justice Sotomayor said. It would be very odd to argue that religions were not treated neutrally and generally applicable and were discriminated against when the reason why you mention them is to actually discriminate in their favor.
No, that's clearly correct. But what about Cole's question about you reach the same result if RFRA or strict?
Oh, that's right. The other end. So that's a completely different analysis, right? Because in that case, it doesn't matter if they're discriminated against or not. I was focusing on the constitutional question and this idea that somehow churches are being discriminated against when they have the same rules apply to them. If you're applying a RFRA analysis, then clearly it's different. So then the first question becomes, is it a substantial burden on the church to not be able to meet? And then the second question becomes, does it survive strict scrutiny? And so clearly the strict scrutiny requires, for the non-American lawyers in the meeting, strict scrutiny requires that the state show that their rule both advances a compelling government interest and that there's not really another way to accomplish the government's interest. And so obviously no one's going to dispute that the government's regulation is compelling. So the real question is about tailoring. And again, I guess you can say that, well, if they have the same regulations applied to secular places as well, then maybe really they believe that there's no other way to accomplish it than by doing this. So the thing about that same question about how are other mass gatherings treated makes a difference in the analysis of how well tailored it is. Because again, if you're applying the same rules to religious and secular gatherings, it may be because mass gatherings are particularly dangerous and these are the regulations that are required.
Cole, do you want to follow up on that at all verbally?
No, I mean, I think that's helpful. And I think it's also helpful to her point about stressing that what her paper was really about is the constitutional restrictions. So it may mean that in the strict scrutiny situation, you have tighter analysis, but it might come out the same way. And I think that's important to recognize. that may raise the question that Kathleen Brady raised, and that is equality sort of analysis the ultimate measure here, or is there another level of church autonomy? They're going to be fairly close together, but that's also a question.
Well, and that's actually a question that Todd McFarland has raised in the chat, saying your paper does not seem to acknowledge that there is a fundamental right to worship separate from any type of discrimination. Do you think there is a fundamental right to worship and not just to be treated differently or equally, I think he means, than other mass gatherings? Or do you think the right to gather for worship is just derived from the right to gather in mass in general?
So my analysis was conducted under the current doctrine. And one thing to understand about constitutional rights in America is that none of them are absolute, and that there can be restrictions even on your constitutional rights. And under the existing doctrine, the rule is, even if a law does affect your ability to practice your religion, it's not going to be deemed unconstitutional if it's a neutral law of general applicability. So you may disagree with that approach to free exercise, and indeed it may not be the rule in the United States for much longer, but I took the law as it currently exists, and my analysis applies that existing law.
Todd, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, so just thanks, Nick. So just briefly, I mean, I understand the Smith doctrine, and that's generally been, but most of the situations there's not been a fundamental right at stake. So for instance, you know, the case that it came up in, which was making a peyote, or all the other situations, I don't think that what the person was wanting to do, they have a fundamental right to do. And this really is just a follow up on, I guess, what Cole said is, do you think that the right to worship, to gather to worship, is a fundamental right that people had, that is subject to all the scrutiny that goes with that, or is it just the right not to be discriminated against?
So I would disagree with you and point out that the Smith case itself that established this right involved a sacrament. And so all the free exercise cases involve things that were crucial to religious worship. So this case is not so different from Smith. And so I completely agree that the right to religious worship is a fundamental right, but so is the right to practice the sacramental use of peyote in Smith. And so again, my response is, yes, there are fundamental rights at stake. Fundamental rights are not absolute. There may be reasons why they can be limited.
So Kathleen Brady, her paper seemed a little bit perhaps coming to some conclusions in some tension with yours. Am I correct in saying, Professor Brady, that you would view a maybe a more robust claim for worship by the churches, or not? Let me put you in dialogue with Professor Corbin on this point, if you're willing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I draw on a different body of case law, and particularly in the court's very recent decisions, this decision this past summer in the Guadalupe case involving teachers of religion at religious schools. The court has or is clearly mentioned a doctrine of church autonomy, drew on a doctrine of church autonomy that speaks of the freedom of religious institutions, not only over matters of doctrine and worship, but closely related matters of church government, essential to the central mission of the church. And that's a direct quote from Guadalupe. And where that doctrine is going to go is an open question, but it's there. And I think it's going to grow, particularly with the current makeup of the court. And I think it's very applicable to these restrictions. They are restrictions on fundamental matters of congregational worship. There really could be, few things that are more central to a church's mission, and the restrictions particularly severe restrictions in New York, affected worship in dramatic ways. And for sacramental churches like the Catholic Church, it isn't the same. You can't just go online for that. So, depending on the particular church, the restrictions even seem more dramatic. So I think the doctrine of church autonomy is relevant. I'm not sure it's probably not getting more play in the case law because it's undeveloped at this point by the court, but it seems very applicable to me. And not only because it's there in the case law, very strongly so since this past summer, but because it's very relevant. And one of the things that struck me listening to the panel this morning was the ways in which in European countries, there's sort of a recognition of religious authorities as being appropriate dialogue partners with government officials, where in the United States, we often tend to view disputes about religious freedom as between the individual and the state. And that clouds the existence of these religious institutions. And I think it's sad that it does, because in contexts like this, and this is going back to what Daniel was saying, there's a lot of polarization. And it would be much better if religious institutions and their leaders were in conversation with government officials. Not only do I think it's constitutionally imperative, but it would be better. You would be able to develop rules that they get more buy-in by religious individuals. We'd be safer, it'd be more stable. So I think all of this, I think, can be drawn out of a doctrine that's developing within the court right now and is appropriate for this context.
And I think Professor Brady's point is buttressed by, the church autonomy doctrine is rooted in the Establishment Clause, not the Free Exercise Clause. So the strict neutrality standard doesn't, and it may be both, I acknowledge that, but there's an argument that the strict neutrality of Smith doesn't apply. And also Smith has developed over the years since it was first handed down with a variety of exceptions, including where there are individualized exemptions and different groups are treated differently, that in fact strict scrutiny might apply. And I think that the Christian legal organizations that Daniel Bennett and Andrew Lewis writes about, they strongly believe that religious freedom is a fundamental right and can't be handled on a purely neutral basis. I guess I'm wondering, just to add to, and I'll let you respond to Professor Brady, what if the strict scrutiny clause does apply, as many think it does or should? Do you really get to the same outcome?
Okay, so the first thing I want to say about church autonomy is the doctrine as it exists today seems to be mostly focused on certainly the cases involving the ministerial exemption, where you see it acknowledged, involves the church's right to pick its leadership, which is quite a different question than whether it needs to follow health regulations or not. So I don't think that the church autonomy doctrine as it currently exists applies in this situation, although Professor Brady is quite right that it may well be expanded into this area given our court. And I think it may also be the case that Smith may not be with us much longer, and so that the question, we would get to strict scrutiny much more quickly. So then, which brings up your question, is would these regulations survive strict scrutiny? And I think I touched on that before, but I'd be happy to go over it again. I certainly think no one questions that there is a compelling government interest in trying to prevent super spreader events that the church services often prove to be. And so the question then becomes tailoring. Is there a less restrictive way to accomplish this? And the answer to that question may not be an answer for the courts. It may be an answer for the political branches relying on the expertise of health officials. And if it's their view that it's really dangerous to have in a red zone where the positive cases are growing or even exploding, and that it really would be very dangerous to have any gathering of more than 10 people, and that's true of all the mass gatherings, then it's certainly plausible to conclude that the law is narrowly tailored. Not necessarily. And I think it will depend on how closely regulated other things are. So for example, it would be a stronger set of regulations if in allowing essential activities, they were more clear about capacity limits than they are now. I do want to point out that sometimes capacity limits differ because they're focused on overall density. And because church gatherings are so much more dense to start with than other places, you have to have a lower percentage cap in churches to reach the same density as you were in other places where people tend not to be as packed together. So I think it is certainly possible to have a carefully crafted set of regulations that do ban mass gatherings and does have an eye on capacity limits that would pass strict scrutiny.
Thank you for responding to a variety of questions here. I do want to allow Andrew Lewis and Daniel Bennett there's been some discussion in the chat about the groups they've focused on. Todd suggested they'd focused on a couple of marginal groups in talking about the rhetoric of the religious movements, and they've responded to this. I'd like to allow either of them to talk about that issue or in fact weigh in on what we've just been discussing here. And I think
Andy, you want to take this one?
Sure, happy to chat. Dan and I put a few thoughts back and forth with Todd in the chat, and I think it's a fair point to say, like, well, there's a bigger group, collection of groups here, and not all of them are engaged in sort of this culture war polarizing stuff that we talked about in the piece. I think that's really fair. One of the there are two things I think at play on how we described it. One, I think we probably will, in a revision, will do a better job of setting some of that up. Okay, and that there are other groups in the sphere, and some of the bigger legal players are not as active on this side. Two things. One, as Dan sort of writes about the Christian legal movement, he looks at particularly like what groups self-identify as part of that. And so we are trying to, so a group like Beckett doesn't self-identify. And so sometimes we see them as sort of tangential to that particular movement. So he talked about that a little bit in the chat. And so that's one thing that's at play on our list. The other thing is, we're really interested in part is sort of the politics of this. And so I think it's a good bit to say that the political sort of grandstanding or the polarizing of religious freedom that comes often from groups that aren't the central players in the religious freedom litigation and the stuff that goes to the Supreme Court. And so what we are trying to do, I think, a bit is highlight how the way the legal issues get translated into partisan politics, and how that can be bad for some of the major players in these sort of First Amendment questions. And so I think that is where we were trying to go with that. We probably can be clearer in nailing some of that down. But Dan, do you have other thoughts to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, after Obergefell, there was this case in Kentucky with Kim Davis saying, "I'm not going to sign these marriage licenses anymore. It's not going to happen." And given the state of the decision and just given the lay of the land, it was a fool's errand, really. But of course, Liberty Counsel was the organization that jumped in there, not to really change the direction of the precedent, but rather to galvanize support on the right and kind of hold Kim Davis up as this martyr hero. And it wasn't an accident, right? Ted Cruz showed up to a rally for her. Mike Huckabee was there, and it was really a first come, first serve of these more polarizing figures to try to galvanize this support. So I think Todd's exactly right. Liberty Counsel, when you look at budget, when you look at the number of cases they actually litigate, don't hold a candle to groups like Beckett or Alliance Defending Freedom. It's not even close. That being said, we still think they can affect the discourse in ways that matter for how the public conceives of these issues.
And some of the most important Supreme Court cases have come from some quite small groups. Look at the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Supreme Court cases that have come down in relation to them. Is there anything either of you want to say about the underlying discussion we've been having here with Professor Corbin and Brady?
No, I think it's really interesting. I think you all kind of alluded to it. We keep talking about Smith as the it's the precedent, it's the thing, but then there's that understanding, well, maybe for not that much longer. And so that's what I'm most curious about, is to see how it's tackled in the months ahead, as it invariably most likely will be.
There's a few questions in the chat that have focused on this question of church autonomy. Brett and Cole have asked about that. I don't know, Professor Corbin did discuss that. Is there any follow-up question that either Brett or Cole have for Professor Corbin in relation to that, or for Professor Brady, as she touched on that as well?
Yeah, my follow-up was to Kathleen Brady. It was really asking about what the limiting principle is as she sees it for autonomy.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't think I would necessarily use the word strict scrutiny, but I would use the word heightened scrutiny, close scrutiny. Clearly, where there's life at stake, there has to be limits on church autonomy. But close scrutiny would mean that when the government acts, it has to justify its restrictions with particularity, with scientific evidence. And Caroline mentioned, for example, the scientific evidence about the risks associated with congregational worship. And as a general matter, I think that's true. But there's a lot of safety measures that governments require and apply, and a lot of these congregations have their own additional mechanisms. And it's undisputed that there were no outbreaks in the congregations involved in the Diocese of Brooklyn case. So I think at the very least, 10 and 25 person caps in what could potentially be very large venues seems overbroad. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yes, right.
Go ahead, finish.
Yeah, and the other thing that I said about church autonomy is the necessity of dialogue between religious leaders and government leaders. And I can't remember, I think someone asked a question about, my point about plans, and isn't that requiring a lot for government to get plans from lots of different churches, as opposed to, fewer interlocutors in Europe. And a lot of these regulations involve getting plans from, say, schools or casinos in Nevada. So it's built into restrictions in other contexts. And out in San Francisco, there are very strong limits on congregational worship. It was no indoor worship for quite a long time. The diocese was in communication with the mayor. There was Capitol Hill Baptist Church in DC. There was communication. There were plans being sent in, but there was not a lot of action. Well, no action, communication, but no action on those plans. So that's what I'm sort of saying. That's not right. There has to be genuine dialogue. So hopefully that would relieve some of the conflict, and you'd get to outcomes that would be outcomes where there would be more agreement. But something like close scrutiny or strict scrutiny, Brett, is what I'm thinking about for church autonomy in this context, because life is at stake.
And what would your response be, Kathleen, to Caroline's point that the autonomy cases have focused on personnel decisions, hiring clergy or teachers that are teaching in a religious school?
Yeah, and they have so far. The holdings are limited. And I think that's why lawyers don't reach for the doctrine, because it's easier to argue discrimination, because you have the Lukumi case, and you have, a court that seems to want, the conservatives, more of them, it's uncomfortable with Smith. So going Lukumi route, finding discrimination seems more promising. And yet I think the underlying theory behind that doctrine, which now is named in Guadalupe, it was actually added that name, church autonomy, and it was spelled out in various passages in Guadalupe. I think it's it's just very appropriate, right? And sure, the holdings are narrow. It's just really the beginning in my view, but I see it going somewhere and I see it appropriate here. So it makes sense you don't see it in the litigation, but I do think it's theoretically appropriate.
Well, and it's an older doctrine, isn't it? I mean, it sort of started with church ownership of church property cases, which did have to do with church order, but church ownership of property is not too far from use of church property. So it doesn't seem a fantasy to think along those lines. Cole, was there anything you wanted to add?
Let's see. Well, I really appreciate this discourse, because I think Caroline is right to say that there are going to be some limits. I think that Kathleen Brady is right that church autonomy may be a way of thinking about this that doesn't track merely equalitarian norms, but there also needs to be some limitations. And what we don't have a good sense for in the church autonomy cases is where the autonomy doctrines sort of run out. In the employment cases, we don't have a clear sense when you move beyond clearly ministerial personnel. Also, I mean, we're not quite sure where the property limits run out in the church property cases, but there is some sense that there are some autonomy issues that are important, and sort of figuring out how they can be asserted in rational ways that don't just exacerbate the culture wars by making it sound like religious groups are making unreasonable claims. I think that's the finding the right way to think about these things is the issue. And I think it's very helpful to be clear that there are going to be some limits. And I think we're sort of being driven to think hard about these in the health context.
Looks like Caroline, you want to?
I just think it's, I mean, part of what's driving these limits is that we have an explosion of cases, which is tied to the partisanship that Professors Bennett and Lewis were talking about. If people just wore their masks everywhere and practice social distancing, then we wouldn't have we wouldn't have such terrible community spread, which would mean that these, we wouldn't have so many red zones where you'd have such strict limits. So I think I'm sorry, that's probably part of the point of your paper was that the politicization of religious liberty is really harming religious liberty. Just the whole politicization of health and basic preventive measures has really led us to the place where we have so many red zones. And if people just did what health officials recommended that they do, then we wouldn't have all these red zones with all these very severe restrictions. That's the point I wanted to.
So I do want to get in a couple of comments from our European friends. This has been largely an North American centric discussion. And Alexi and Alejandro have been talking about the fact, it was referenced earlier that having dialogue between religious leaders and civic leaders could maybe short circuit some of these problems. And Alexi made the point that the religious field is much more dispersed in the US, it's much more structured in Europe, but one of their growing issues is the difficulty for states to identify legitimate and viable interlocutors because of religious diversification. And Alejandro agreed with that, but that states cannot force confessions to organize themselves, but it would be interesting for them to realize that the main beneficiaries of organizing and having an interlocutor would be themselves, and the results are good. I don't know if there's a particular question there. Alexi, would you like to make that into a question or comment, or Alejandro?
Well, that was a kind of an elaboration. I put an earlier comment just about the feasibility of not so much, the Catholic Conference of Bishops, but of individual non-denominational churches, for example, the United States being able to submit plans in a timely and efficient manner in the United States. It seemed to me that that would be more of an issue in the United States than would be in Europe. But this question of who's representing the congregations beyond individual parishes or beyond individual churches, it raises it.
And it goes to Professor Lund's point about how worship is often protected in a Protestant-oriented way, perhaps because there aren't adequate representatives of these other religious groups to make the definition more truly neutral and inclusive. And I do think that's an ongoing problem that we haven't really come to grips with, and probably need to talk about, where my church is a sort of low church Protestant heritage. So meeting in person isn't as vital as it would be for a sacramental church. And this is often reflected, it seems to me, in our regulations. And how can we come up with a fairer approach to what religious freedom or worship looks like is something I think we're going to need to discuss. We are a couple of minutes past our closing time. We're not on a television schedule. We're not all going to disappear, or we haven't disappeared, but we should probably draw it to a close unless there are, do any of our panelists have any final remarks or comments that they feel they haven't had the opportunity to say or would like to conclude with? All right, well, I think it's been a very lively and interesting discussion. I hope all of you, or at least many of you, can come back tomorrow to continue it and to keep it going. We will actually be taking a bit longer tomorrow in the afternoon if you can stay for it. We have 2 panels tomorrow like we did today, following a very similar format. But we did want to spend half an hour to 45 minutes beyond the end to talk about the possibility of continued dialogue and perhaps even collaboration as an informal group in maybe putting our thoughts together into some sort of guidelines, having a working group that may communicate on a bi-monthly basis for the next few months, as everyone everywhere seems to be facing these very questions, and that this group of scholars and experts could conceivably contribute to. So we hope you can stay around for that tomorrow. That will happen after the second panel ends at 1:30.